Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Officer Michael Patterson had seen plenty of family disputes turn ugly during his 15 years with the NYPD, but nothing quite prepared him for the Whitmore case. It started as a routine call on a bitter February morning. Elderly woman found dead in her Park Avenue penthouse. Family requesting a welfare check that turned into something much darker. The call came in at 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday that was already shaping up to be one of those days that tested every cop's patience. Snow was falling in thick, wet flakes that made the streets treacherous, and the radio had been crackling with fender benders and slip-and-fall accidents since dawn. Patterson was working the Upper East Side beat, covering the territory where New York's wealthiest residents lived behind doormen and security systems that usually kept the city's problems at bay. Unit 23, respond to 1247 Park Avenue, apartment 18B. Dispatch crackled through his radio. Welfare check requested by family member. Elderly female, unresponsive to phone calls and door knocks. Patterson acknowledged the call and began the familiar drive through Manhattan's Canyon of Wealth. Park Avenue, between 60th and 96th Street, was lined with buildings that housed some of the most expensive real estate in the world. Co-ops and condominiums, where apartments sold for tens of millions of dollars, and where the average resident probably paid more in monthly maintenance fees than most New Yorkers earned in a year. 1247 Park Avenue was one of the more prestigious addresses. A pre-war building with limestone facades and the kind of architectural details that spoke of old money and established power. The doorman, a distinguished-looking man in his 60s who introduced himself as James, was waiting when Patterson arrived. "Officer, thank you for coming so quickly," James said, his voice carrying the subtle authority that came from years of managing the comings and goings of very important people. "I've been working this building for 23 years, and I've never known Mrs. Whitmore to miss her morning routine." "What's her normal routine?" "Every morning at exactly 7 o'clock, Mrs. Whitmore would come down to the lobby to collect her newspapers and check her mail. She'd spend a few minutes chatting with me about the weather or current events, then return to her apartment. Yesterday and today, nothing. Her newspapers are still sitting in the mailroom, and she hasn't answered her door or her phone." James led Patterson through a lobby that looked like it belonged in a European palace rather than a New York apartment building. Marble floors polished to mirror brightness. Crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's houses. Furniture that had been crafted by artisans whose names were studied in art history classes. Everything about the space was designed to remind residents and visitors that they were in the presence of serious wealth, the kind of money that had been accumulating interest for generations. The elevator that carried them to the 18th floor was operated by hand, controlled by another uniformed employee who nodded respectfully as they rose through the building. Patterson had worked Manhattan long enough to be familiar with the rituals of wealth, but he never got used to the sheer excess of it all. These people lived in a completely different world from the one most New Yorkers inhabited, a world where money solved problems before they became problems, and where influence could make inconvenient truths disappear. Apartment 18B occupied half of the 18th floor, with double doors that opened onto what James described as one of the most spectacular apartments in the building. The apartment had been in the Whitmore family for over 40 years, purchased when Margaret and her husband Robert had been establishing themselves as major players in Manhattan real estate and society. But when they knocked on those impressive double doors, there was no response. James used his master key to open the door, calling out as they entered. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is James from the front desk. I have a police officer with me to check on your welfare." The apartment that greeted them was a museum of wealth accumulated over generations. The foyer alone was larger than most New York studio apartments, with a chandelier that had been crafted in Venice by artisans who had learned their trade from masters dating back to the Renaissance. The floors were made from marble that had been quarried in Italy and transported to New York at enormous expense, and the walls were covered with silk wallpaper that had been handmade by craftsmen whose waiting lists extended for years. Oil paintings that Patterson recognized from art history textbooks hung in positions of honor throughout the visible rooms. A Monet here, a Picasso there, artwork that belonged in museums but that the Whitmore family had collected over decades of patient acquisition and enormous expenditure. Each piece probably cost more than Patterson would earn in his entire career, but they were displayed with casual elegance, as if priceless art was simply part of the normal decoration of daily life. But it was the silence that struck Patterson most immediately. Not just the absence of sound, but the quality of the silence. Heavy, oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. In his experience, apartments where people lived alone always had ambient noise. Air conditioning systems, refrigerator hums, television murmurs, the small sounds of daily life that indicated human habitation. This apartment felt abandoned, like it had been empty for days rather than hours. "Mrs. Whitmore?" James called again, his voice echoing slightly in the large spaces. "Are you here?" They moved through the apartment systematically, checking each room for signs of the elderly woman who should have been starting her daily routine hours earlier. The kitchen was spotless, with expensive appliances that looked like they'd been cleaned by professional staff. The dining room featured a table that could seat 12 people comfortably, surrounded by chairs that had probably been crafted in the 18th century and maintained in perfect condition through generations of careful ownership. They found Margaret Whitmore in what James identified as her morning room, a sunlit space overlooking Central Park where she apparently spent her early hours reading newspapers and reviewing financial reports. She was seated in a wingback chair that had probably been in her family for decades, upholstered in fabric that felt like silk, and positioned to take advantage of the morning light streaming through windows that offered a commanding view of the park and the city beyond. At first glance, it looked like the peaceful death of an elderly woman who had simply fallen asleep while reading. Margaret Whitmore was 86 years old, according to James, and she appeared to have died without struggle or distress. Her clothing was neat and undisturbed, an expensive dress that had been chosen with care, jewelry that had probably belonged to her mother and grandmother, hair that had been styled with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of a woman who maintained her appearance even in her final years. Her hands were folded in her lap, as if she'd consciously prepared herself for death, and her face showed no signs of pain or fear. A delicate china teacup sat on the table beside her chair, the tea long since grown cold, but still retaining the faint aroma of Earl Grey. Next to the teacup was a financial newspaper open to the stock market pages, reading glasses folded neatly beside it, and a small notepad where she'd apparently been making calculations related to her investment portfolio. But Patterson had responded to enough natural deaths during his career to recognize when something was wrong with the scene, and everything about Margaret Whitmore's death felt staged rather than natural. People who died suddenly, even in their sleep, rarely maintained such perfect composure. There was usually some sign of distress. Hands clutched to the chest as hearts failed, bodies twisted as people tried to call for help. Cups or books dropped as consciousness faded and muscle control was lost. Margaret Whitmore looked like she'd been posed by someone who wanted her death to appear as peaceful and natural as possible. Her position was too perfect, her expression too serene, her surroundings too carefully arranged. It was as if someone had taken great care to create a tableau of peaceful death, down to the smallest details of hand position and facial expression. James, when did you last see Mrs. Whitmore alive? Sunday afternoon, around 4 o'clock. She was returning from her weekly visit to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She seemed perfectly normal, alert, walking steadily, carrying on a conversation about an exhibition she'd just seen. She mentioned that she was looking forward to a quiet evening at home reviewing some family documents. Did she have any health problems that you were aware of? Mrs. Whitmore was remarkably healthy for her age, officer. She walked everywhere instead of using cars or taxis, took no medications except daily vitamins, and had the energy and mental sharpness of someone 20 years younger. Her doctor had told her just last month that she had the vital signs of a 70-year-old. That's why her absence from her morning routine was so unusual and concerning. Patterson began his preliminary examination of the scene, noting details that would help him understand what had happened in this apartment between Sunday afternoon and Tuesday morning. Margaret's teacup contained what appeared to be Earl Grey tea, though there was a slightly bitter smell that didn't quite match the bergamot fragrance typically associated with that particular blend. The bitterness was subtle, barely noticeable unless someone was specifically looking for it. Her reading glasses were folded neatly on the table beside her chair, and there was a financial newspaper open to the stock market pages where she'd apparently been checking on her investments. A small notepad beside the newspaper contained calculations in her careful handwriting, showing that she'd been actively managing her substantial portfolio up until the time of her death. But what caught Patterson's attention most were Margaret's hands. While her overall appearance suggested a peaceful death, her fingernails showed signs of damage that indicated she'd been gripping something tightly in the moments before she died. The nail beds were slightly discolored, and there were faint scratches on her palms that suggested she'd been clutching something hard enough to break the skin. More concerning were the barely visible marks on her wrists that could have been caused by restraint. The marks were so subtle that they might easily be overlooked by someone who wasn't looking carefully, but they were there. Thin lines that suggested something had been wrapped around her wrists, possibly to prevent her from struggling or calling for help. James, I need you to call the medical examiner's office and request an immediate response. I also need you to contact the building security office and ask them to preserve any surveillance footage from the past 48 hours. This is now being treated as a potential crime scene, and I need everyone except essential personnel to stay out of the apartment. James looked genuinely shocked by the suggestion that Margaret's death might not have been natural. Crime scene? Officer, Mrs. Whitmore was 86 years old. Surely this was simply her time. Maybe, but I need to be thorough. In the meantime, I need you to contact Mrs. Whitmore's family members and ask them to come to the building as soon as possible. I'll need to interview them about her recent activities, her state of mind, and any concerns she might have expressed about her safety or security. While waiting for the medical examiner to arrive, Patterson conducted a systematic examination of the apartment, looking for anything that might explain how an apparently healthy 86-year-old woman had died suddenly in her morning chair. What he found painted a picture of a woman who had been living in increasing fear and paranoia over the past several months. Margaret's bedroom contained a small wall safe hidden behind a reproduction of a famous painting, positioned where it would be invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. The safe was standing open, its contents apparently removed by someone who had forced it open using sophisticated tools. There were scratches around the lock mechanism that indicated professional work, and there were scattered papers on the floor that suggested someone had been searching through important documents with considerable urgency. The papers that remained on the floor included financial statements, insurance documents, and legal papers that appeared to relate to her late husband's estate. But there were obvious gaps in the documentation, missing pages that had been torn out, file folders that had been emptied, and clear evidence that someone had been looking for specific documents rather than conducting a general search. More disturbing was what Patterson found in Margaret's personal study, a room that had been completely ransacked by someone who was looking for something specific, and who had been willing to destroy the room's contents to find it. File cabinets had been emptied and their contents dumped across the floor. Desk drawers had been pulled out entirely and overturned, and even the books on the shelves had been pulled out and examined, with many of them thrown carelessly aside. This wasn't random vandalism or the work of ordinary burglars looking for easily portable valuables. This was a systematic search conducted by someone who knew that Margaret kept important information somewhere in the apartment, and who was determined to find it regardless of the time and effort required. The searchers had been thorough, but not entirely successful. Hidden behind a false back in one of the desk drawers, Patterson found a leather-bound journal that had apparently been overlooked in the frantic search. The journal contained entries dating back several months, written in Margaret's careful handwriting, and the entries painted a picture of a woman who had been increasingly suspicious of her family's motives and fearful for her own safety. The earliest entries from the previous summer were relatively benign. Notes about family gatherings, observations about her children's behavior, concerns about their financial management and lifestyle choices. But as the months progressed, the tone of the entries became increasingly dark and paranoid. By October, Margaret was writing about her growing suspicion that her late husband's death had not been the accident it had appeared to be. She had begun to notice inconsistencies in the official reports, discrepancies in her children's accounts of that day, and financial irregularities that suggested someone had benefited substantially from Robert's death. By December, she was writing about hiring a private investigator to look into the circumstances surrounding her husband's death 15 years earlier. She had begun to suspect that her children might have been involved in Robert's death, and she was determined to uncover the truth regardless of the consequences for the family. The most recent entries, dating from just weeks before her death, were genuinely frightening. Margaret was writing about direct threats from her children, about their demands that she stop investigating their father's death, and about her growing certainty that they would kill her rather than allow her to expose whatever crimes they had committed. The final entry, dated just 3 days before her death, was particularly chilling. They know that I know. Thomas confronted me today about the private investigator I hired to look into Robert's death. He was angrier than I've seen him since he was a child, more threatening than I ever imagined my own son could be. He demanded that I stop stirring up ancient history, and warned me that my paranoid delusions were embarrassing the family reputation. But I've seen the evidence now. I know what they did to Robert, and I know they'll do the same to me if I threaten to expose them. I've made copies of all the important documents and hidden them where they'll never think to look. If something happens to me, at least the truth will survive long enough for justice to be served. The entry was signed with Margaret's initials and dated February 19th, exactly 3 days before her death was discovered. Patterson felt a chill run down his spine as he realized he was looking at what might be a woman's final words, written by someone who knew she was in mortal danger from her own children, but who was determined to pursue justice regardless of the personal cost. The family arrived within 2 hours of being contacted, and Patterson immediately understood what Margaret had meant about feeling threatened by people who should have loved and protected her. Thomas Whitmore, Margaret's eldest son, swept into the apartment like he already owned it, which, Patterson supposed, he probably did now that his mother was dead. He was in his mid-50s, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Patterson made in a month, and he carried himself with the kind of arrogant confidence that came from never having to worry about money, consequences, or accountability. Behind Thomas came his younger brother David, who seemed nervous and uncomfortable in a way that contrasted sharply with his older brother's commanding presence. David was fidgeting constantly, his eyes darting around the apartment like he was looking for something specific or worried about what might be discovered by the police investigation. His hands shook slightly when he lit a cigarette, and he kept checking his watch as if he had somewhere else he needed to be. The third family member was Jennifer, Thomas and David's sister, who appeared to be in her early 50s, and who radiated the kind of cold efficiency that suggested she was accustomed to managing difficult situations and controlling outcomes through careful planning and execution. She was taking notes on everything: the apartment's condition, the presence of police personnel, the preliminary cause of death, as if she was already planning how to control the narrative around their mother's death and minimize any damage to the family's reputation. "Officer Patterson," Thomas extended a manicured hand in greeting. "I'm Thomas Whitmore, Margaret's eldest son. This is my brother David and my sister Jennifer. This is obviously a terrible tragedy for our family, but I'm sure you'll find that our mother died of natural causes. She was 86 years old and had been in declining health for some time, though she was too proud to admit it." Patterson studied the three siblings as they surveyed their mother's apartment and her body. There was something about their behavior that struck him as fundamentally wrong for people who had just lost their mother. They seemed more concerned with assessing the value of Margaret's possessions than with grieving her death. Jennifer was already examining jewelry and artwork with the eye of someone calculating values. David was looking through financial documents on Margaret's desk as if he was trying to understand the scope of her wealth. And Thomas was evaluating the apartment itself as if he was already planning renovations or sale. "Actually, Mr. Whitmore, I have some questions about your mother's recent activities and state of mind. The scene here suggests that her death might not have been as natural as it initially appeared. When did you last speak with her?" The three siblings exchanged glances that lasted just a fraction too long, the kind of wordless communication that suggested they had discussed this moment and prepared coordinated responses to likely questions from law enforcement. "I spoke with Mother last Tuesday," Thomas replied carefully, his voice controlled, but with an undertone that suggested he was choosing his words very deliberately. She seemed agitated about various family matters, more so than usual. She'd been increasingly paranoid in recent months, convinced that people were plotting against her, making wild accusations about family members. "What kind of accusations?" Jennifer stepped forward, her voice sharp and controlled in a way that suggested she was accustomed to managing conversations and directing them toward predetermined conclusions. "Officer, our mother had been showing clear signs of age-related dementia for over a year. She made wild accusations against family members, claimed that people were stealing from her, insisted that our father's death 15 years ago was somehow suspicious rather than the tragic accident it obviously was. It was heartbreaking to watch her mental deterioration, but we tried to be patient with her delusions." "Your father died 15 years ago?" "Boating accident." David spoke for the first time, his voice carefully modulated but with an underlying tremor that suggested he was more nervous than he was trying to appear. "Father was alone on the family yacht when there was a gas explosion. The Coast Guard and local police investigated thoroughly and concluded that it was caused by a mechanical failure, a gas leak that ignited when he started the engine. It was a terrible tragedy, but it was definitely accidental." Patterson made detailed notes about the family's responses, particularly noting how they seemed to be working together to minimize Margaret's concerns about her husband's death and attribute her suspicions to mental illness. But the journal entries he'd read suggested a woman who was quite lucid and who had specific evidence to support her fears about her family's involvement in her husband's death. "I understand your mother had been meeting with lawyers recently about changes to her will. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Patterson could practically feel the tension radiating from the three siblings. Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Jennifer's note-taking stopped abruptly, and David began fidgeting even more noticeably than before. "Mother changed her will constantly," Thomas replied after a pause that lasted just long enough to be noticeable and concerning. "It was practically a hobby of hers, I think. A way to maintain control over the family, even as she aged. She would threaten to disinherit us whenever she was displeased with something we'd done or failed to do. It was her primary method of family management." "Were you concerned about being disinherited?" "Officer?" Jennifer's voice had taken on an edge that suggested she was running out of patience with the line of questioning. "Our mother was worth approximately $200 million. Her estate includes real estate holdings, investment portfolios, artwork, and jewelry that have been in our family for generations. Of course, we were concerned about her increasingly erratic decisions regarding the distribution of that wealth, especially when those decisions seemed to be based on paranoid delusions rather than rational considerations." Patterson noted Jennifer's frank admission that the family fortune was substantial, and that they were indeed concerned about their inheritance. Most genuinely grieving children wouldn't be discussing their parents' wealth so openly, and calculating just hours after discovering the death. But the Whitmore siblings seemed more focused on financial implications than on mourning their mother, or understanding what had happened to her. "I'll need contact information for your mother's attorney and her financial advisors. I'll also need to know where each of you were yesterday evening, between 6 p.m. and midnight." David's fidgeting became noticeably more pronounced at the mention of alibis. "Why do you need to know where we were? Mother died of natural causes, didn't she? I mean, she was 86 years old living alone in this enormous apartment. These things happen." "I'm conducting a thorough investigation, Mr. Whitmore. It's standard procedure when someone dies unexpectedly, especially when valuable assets are involved and when there are indications that the deceased might have felt threatened." Thomas provided alibis for all three siblings without hesitation, as if he had been expecting the question and had prepared an answer in advance. They had all been at a family dinner at his estate in the Hamptons, he claimed, along with his wife Susan and several household staff members who could verify their presence throughout the evening. The dinner had lasted until well past midnight, and they had all stayed overnight rather than driving back to the city in bad weather. But something about the way Thomas delivered this information suggested it was a prepared response rather than a spontaneous recollection of the previous evening's activities. The details were too precise, the timeline too carefully constructed, and the supporting witnesses too conveniently positioned to provide complete alibis for all three siblings simultaneously. After the family left, promising to provide contact information for Margaret's legal and financial advisors, Patterson continued his examination of the apartment. In Margaret's bedroom, he found additional evidence that someone had been searching through her personal belongings with considerable urgency and thoroughness. Jewelry boxes had been opened and their contents examined. Important papers had been shuffled through and partially removed, and there were signs that someone had been looking for something specific rather than conducting a general search for valuables. The searchers had been systematic but not entirely successful in covering their tracks. Behind a loose baseboard in Margaret's walk-in closet, Patterson found a manila envelope that had apparently been hidden there recently. The envelope contained photocopies of financial documents, insurance papers, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs that suggested Margaret had been conducting her own investigation into her family's activities. But the most significant discovery came when Patterson found Margaret's personal address book, which contained contact information for a private investigator named Linda Mitchell. Next to Mitchell's name, Margaret had written several notations in her careful handwriting. "Working on Robert's case has found crucial evidence. meeting scheduled for Wednesday to review final proof. Wednesday was the day after Margaret's death had been discovered. She had been planning to meet with a private investigator who had found evidence related to her husband's death, but she had died just hours before that meeting was scheduled to take place. The timing was suspicious enough to suggest that someone had known about the meeting and had acted to prevent it from occurring. Patterson called Linda Mitchell immediately, reaching her at her office in Queens. Mitchell was in her early 60s with a voice that suggested she'd seen everything the city had to offer and wasn't easily surprised or intimidated. "Officer Patterson, I was expecting Margaret to call me this morning about our meeting. When she didn't show up and didn't answer her phone, I was genuinely concerned. Margaret Whitmore was the most punctual person I've ever worked with. She never missed appointments and she never failed to return calls promptly. Ms. Mitchell, what kind of evidence had you found regarding Robert Whitmore's death?" "Evidence that it wasn't an accident, officer. Robert Whitmore was murdered by his own children, and I have documentation that proves it. Margaret hired me 8 months ago to investigate inconsistencies she'd noticed in the official reports about her husband's death. What I found was a conspiracy that goes back 15 years. Patterson felt his pulse quicken as the scope of the case began to expand beyond a simple, suspicious death. "What kind of evidence are we talking about?" "Financial records showing that all 3 Whitmore children were in serious debt before their father's death. Gambling debts, embezzlement charges, legal problems that would have destroyed them socially and financially. But after Robert died and the insurance money was distributed, all their problems mysteriously disappeared. Engineering reports that I commissioned showing that the yacht explosion was caused by sabotage, not mechanical failure. And most importantly, recorded conversations between the 3 siblings discussing their father's death in terms that make it absolutely clear they were responsible for murdering him." "You have recordings of them discussing the murder?" "Margaret had been secretly recording family meetings for months, officer. She suspected her children of killing their father, and she was building a case against them. The recordings I have are absolutely damning. They talk about Robert's death like it was a business transaction they'd successfully completed, and they discuss Margaret's investigation as a threat that needed to be eliminated." Patterson felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Margaret Whitmore hadn't just been a paranoid elderly woman making wild accusations against her family. She had been a determined investigator who had uncovered evidence of a 15-year-old murder and who had been killed to prevent her from exposing her children's crimes. "Ms. Mitchell, I need to meet with you immediately to review all the evidence you've compiled. And I need you to understand that Margaret Whitmore is dead, and her death is looking very suspicious." "I was afraid of that," Mitchell replied grimly. "Margaret told me she was frightened of her children, that she believed they would kill her rather than let her expose their crime. I tried to convince her to go to the police immediately, but she wanted to wait until we had absolutely conclusive evidence. I think waiting cost her her life." Patterson arranged to meet with Mitchell that afternoon, but first he needed to wait for the medical examiner's preliminary findings on Margaret's death. Dr. Sarah Williams, the medical examiner, completed her initial examination that evening and called Patterson with results that confirmed his growing suspicions. "This definitely wasn't a natural death, Officer Patterson. Margaret Whitmore was killed by a sophisticated combination of drugs that would have caused her to lose consciousness gradually before stopping her heart. The drugs were administered in her tea. I found concentrated traces of them in the cup beside her chair, and the toxicology results show lethal levels in her bloodstream." "What kind of drugs?" "A veterinary sedative combined with a cardiac medication that would be fatal in the dosage that was used. This is very sophisticated work. Someone with extensive medical knowledge planned this death very carefully to make it appear natural. The drug combination would have made her drowsy and compliant first, then unconscious, then would have stopped her heart in a way that would mimic natural cardiac failure. If you hadn't specifically requested a comprehensive toxicology screening, we would almost certainly have ruled this death from natural causes. Patterson felt the familiar surge of anger that came with discovering premeditated murder disguised as natural death. Someone had planned Margaret Whitmore's death with meticulous care, using their knowledge of her routines, her trust in them, and sophisticated pharmaceutical knowledge to kill her in a way that would avoid detection. They had made it look like the peaceful death of an elderly woman, but it was actually a calculated murder designed to silence someone who had evidence of previous crimes. Dr. Williams. How long would it have taken for the drugs to take effect? Based on the concentrations I found and the method of administration, she would have begun feeling drowsy within 10 to 15 minutes of drinking the tea. Complete unconsciousness would have occurred within 30 minutes, and cardiac arrest would have followed within an hour. The person who did this had plenty of time to search her apartment and remove evidence while she was dying. The next morning, Patterson met with Linda Mitchell at her office in Queens. Mitchell's operation was professional, but no frills. Metal desks, filing cabinets, and computer equipment that was focused on function rather than appearance. The office walls were covered with photographs, documents, and timeline charts that suggested Mitchell specialized in complex cases requiring extensive documentation and analysis. Mitchell herself was exactly what Patterson had expected from their phone conversations: sharp, experienced, and absolutely convinced that the Whitmore family had committed multiple murders over the span of 15 years. Officer Patterson, I've been investigating the Whitmore family for 8 months, and I can prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Thomas, David, and Jennifer Whitmore murdered their father in 2009 and murdered their mother this week to prevent her from exposing their previous crime. Mitchell spread her evidence across her desk like a prosecutor preparing for the most important trial of her career. Financial records, insurance documents, maritime accident reports, engineering analyses, surveillance photographs, audio recordings, and timeline charts that told a story of premeditated murder spanning 15 years and involving meticulous planning, execution, and cover-up. Robert Whitmore's death wasn't a tragic boating accident. It was a carefully planned murder made to look like an accident, executed by his 3 children who needed his insurance money to solve serious financial problems that threatened to destroy their lives and social standing. Mitchell pulled out bank records and legal documents that confirmed her allegations. The Whitmore children had indeed been facing catastrophic financial and legal problems in 2009, problems that would have sent them to prison and destroyed their family's reputation. Thomas had been embezzling substantial amounts from the family business to cover his own gambling losses and was facing potential criminal charges. David owed over $2 million to loan sharks who were threatening increasingly violent consequences for non-payment. Jennifer had been involved in an elaborate art forgery scheme that was about to be exposed by federal investigators, with charges that could have resulted in decades in federal prison. But after Robert died and the life insurance paid out $50 million, all their problems magically disappeared. Thomas's embezzlement charges were dropped when the missing money was quietly repaid. David's gambling debts were satisfied in full with interest. Jennifer's legal problems vanished when key witnesses suddenly became unavailable, and evidence mysteriously disappeared from federal custody. How can you prove the yacht explosion was sabotage rather than accident? Mitchell pulled out a thick pile of technical documents and expert analyses. I hired the best marine engineering experts in the country to review the original accident investigation, and their conclusions are unambiguous. The explosion pattern was completely inconsistent with a natural gas leak, It was caused by an improvised explosive device that was specifically designed to destroy evidence of tampering while creating maximum destructive force. She showed Patterson detailed diagrams and photographs that illustrated the expert findings. David Whitmore has extensive knowledge of marine engines from his yachting hobby, and Thomas has an engineering background that would have given him the technical skills needed to build a delayed action explosive device. They planned the explosion to occur when Robert was alone on the yacht, several hours after they had left the marina and established their alibis. Patterson studied the engineering reports, which concluded with high confidence that the yacht explosion had been caused by deliberate sabotage rather than accidental gas leak. The evidence was highly technical and would require expert testimony to explain to a jury, but it clearly supported Mitchell's theory that Robert Whitmore had been murdered by his children. What about the alibis? You mentioned they had established alibis for the time of the explosion. They were all at a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum when the explosion occurred, with hundreds of witnesses, security cameras, and documented arrival and departure times. But the explosive device was designed with a timer that would create the explosion hours after they had finished tampering with the yacht's engine systems. Mitchell showed Patterson security footage from the marina, where the yacht had been moored, enhanced and analyzed to show the Whitmore siblings boarding the yacht earlier in the day, remaining on board for approximately 2 hours, then leaving several hours before the explosion occurred. Marine experts estimate that the modifications they made to the engine would have taken 90 minutes to complete, allowing plenty of time for them to finish their work, return to shore, clean up, and arrive at the charity gala with perfect alibis. What about the audio recordings you mentioned? Mitchell connected a digital audio player to speakers on her desk. Margaret started recording family meetings after she became suspicious about her children's behavior and their evasive responses to her questions about their father's death. These conversations took place over the past 6 months, and they reveal exactly what kind of people we're dealing with. The first recording was from a family meeting in September, just a month after Margaret had hired Mitchell to investigate Robert's death. Margaret's voice was clear and strong as she confronted her children with her growing suspicions. "I've been reviewing the documents from your father's death, and there are inconsistencies that I can't explain." The insurance investigation was remarkably brief for such a large claim. The Coast Guard report contains technical conclusions that don't match the physical evidence. And most disturbing, the three of you have given different accounts of that day's events when I've asked you about them separately. Thomas's response was measured but with an undertone of irritation. "Mother, you're looking for problems where none exist." Father's death was investigated thoroughly by multiple agencies, all of whom concluded that it was a tragic accident. Then explain to me why all three of you had your debts paid off within weeks of receiving the insurance money. Thomas, your gambling losses disappeared. David, your loan shark problems vanished overnight. Jennifer, your legal troubles evaporated. That's an awful lot of coincidences. Jennifer's voice was sharp, with barely controlled anger. "Mother, we used our inheritance to solve financial problems. That's what inheritance is for. There's nothing suspicious about children using money left by their father to improve their financial situations. But your father hadn't left you that money. You inherited it because he died unexpectedly. And he died just when all three of you desperately needed large amounts of cash to solve problems that could have destroyed your lives." David's voice was shaking with what sounded like genuine fear. "Mother, what exactly are you suggesting? That we killed our own father? I'm suggesting that the evidence points toward something other than accident, and I want to understand what really happened on that yacht." The recording continued for another 30 minutes. with the three siblings alternately denying Margaret's accusations and expressing increasing frustration with her investigation. But what was most chilling to Patterson was the cold, businesslike way they discussed their father's death. Not with grief or sadness, but with annoyance that their carefully constructed story was being questioned. The second recording was from a family meeting in November, after Mitchell's investigation had begun to produce substantial evidence. Margaret's tone had become more accusatory, and her children's responses had become more threatening. "Margaret, I've hired a private investigator to look into your father's death, and she's found evidence that contradicts the official accident report. Engineering experts have concluded that the yacht explosion was caused by sabotage, not mechanical failure." Thomas: "Mother, you're wasting money on conspiracy theories. Even if these so-called experts have found irregularities, that doesn't prove anything, except that investigations conducted 15 years ago might not have used the most advanced techniques available today." Margaret: "The experts are quite certain that someone tampered with the yacht's engine system. Someone with knowledge of marine engines and access to explosive materials. Someone who knew exactly when your father would be using the yacht and who had the opportunity to plant a delayed action device." Jennifer: "Even if that were true, Mother, and I'm not saying it is, what would be the point of destroying our family over something that happened 15 years ago? Nothing we do now will bring Father back." Margaret: "The point would be justice. The point would be ensuring that murder doesn't go unpunished, even when it's committed by people who think their wealth and social position make them untouchable." David: "Mother, please think about what you're doing. These accusations could destroy our family's reputation, destroy businesses that employ hundreds of people, destroy charitable foundations that help thousands of people every year." Margaret: "Our family's reputation was destroyed the day you murdered your father. I'm just making sure the truth finally comes to light." Thomas: "If you continue down this path, Mother, there will be consequences. Legal consequences for defamation, financial consequences for the family business, social consequences for all of us. Are you prepared to accept responsibility for destroying everything our family has built?" Margaret: "Are you threatening me, Thomas?" Thomas: "I'm explaining reality to you. Actions have consequences, and you need to consider what the consequences of your actions might be for everyone involved." The recording ended with the sound of chairs scraping and footsteps as the three siblings left the apartment. Margaret could be heard talking to herself in a voice that was shaking with either fear or rage. "They killed Robert, and now they're threatening to kill me. But I have evidence now. I have proof. They won't get away with it this time." The third recording was from a family meeting just 2 weeks before Margaret's death, and it was the most disturbing of all. By this point, Margaret had assembled enough evidence to present a compelling case for murder, and her children's responses had become openly threatening. Margaret: "I've scheduled a meeting with the Manhattan District Attorney for next Friday. I'm going to turn over all the evidence I've gathered about your father's murder, the financial records, the engineering reports, the insurance documents, everything." The silence that followed lasted for nearly 30 seconds before Thomas responded, his voice cold and controlled. "Mother, I strongly advise you to reconsider that decision. The consequences could be very serious for everyone involved." Margaret: "The consequences were serious 15 years ago when you murdered your father. Now it's time to face those consequences." Jennifer: "Mother, if you go to the DA with these accusations, you'll be opening yourself up to serious legal liability. Defamation lawsuits, criminal charges for filing false reports, psychiatric evaluation for making delusional accusations against your own children." Margaret: "Delusional?" I have documented evidence of your crimes. Financial records that show your debts and the timing of their payment. Engineering reports that prove the yacht explosion was sabotage. Insurance records that show how quickly and quietly the claim was paid. David. Mother, even if some of that evidence suggests irregularities, it doesn't prove that we killed Father. There could be innocent explanations for all of it. Margaret. Innocent explanations. David, you owed $2 million to people who break legs for late payments. Thomas, you had embezzled $300,000 and were about to be prosecuted. Jennifer, you were facing federal charges that would have sent you to prison for 20 years. All three of you desperately needed money, and all three of you had the knowledge and opportunity to sabotage your father's yacht. Thomas, if you go through with this, Mother, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. However long that might be. The threat in Thomas's voice was unmistakable, and Margaret clearly understood the implication. Her response showed remarkable courage in the face of intimidation from her own children. Are you threatening to kill me, Thomas? Just like you killed your father. Jennifer. Nobody's threatening anyone, Mother. We're just pointing out that your actions will have consequences for the entire family, including yourself. Margaret. The only consequences I'm concerned about are the ones you'll face when you're convicted of murder. I have enough evidence to put all three of you in prison for the rest of your lives, and I intend to see that justice is finally served. Thomas. Mother, you need to understand something. We've built lives, careers, families, charitable foundations on the money from Father's insurance. If you destroy that, you'll be destroying the lives of hundreds of innocent people, our spouses, our children, our employees, the beneficiaries of our charitable work. Margaret. You built all of that on blood money from murdering your father. If it's destroyed, it should be destroyed. It was never legitimate to begin with. David, what do you want from us, Mother? What would it take for you to drop this investigation? Margaret, I want you to confess to what you did. I want you to turn yourselves into the police. I want you to face the consequences of your actions like adults, instead of hiding behind wealth and influence. Jennifer, that's never going to happen. We're not going to destroy our lives to satisfy your need for justice over ancient history. Margaret, then I'll destroy them for you. The meeting with the DA is scheduled for Friday morning at 10 o'clock. I suggest you use the time between now and then to prepare for the rest of your lives in prison. The recording ended with sounds of a violent argument, raised voices, furniture being moved, what sounded like physical struggle. Then Margaret's voice, shaky but determined, "Get out of my apartment. Get out, and don't come back. The next time I see any of you, it will be in a courtroom where you're being sentenced for murder." Patterson listened to the recordings with growing horror and admiration. Margaret Whitmore had not only discovered that her children were murderers, she had confronted them directly with that knowledge, knowing full well that doing so would put her own life in danger. Her courage was remarkable, but it had also made her murder inevitable. Miss Mitchell, do you have any evidence of the actual planning for Margaret's murder? I have one more recording, officer. This one was made by a listening device that Margaret had hidden in her apartment after she became convinced that her children were planning to kill her. The device recorded a conversation between the three siblings on Sunday evening, just 2 days before Margaret's death was discovered. Mitchell loaded a different audio file and adjusted the volume. The sound quality was slightly muffled, but the voices were clearly identifiable as the three Whitmore siblings. Thomas. She's going to destroy all of us if we don't act immediately. The meeting with the DA is scheduled for Friday morning. We have less than 5 days to solve this problem permanently. Jennifer, What are our options? We've tried reasoning with her. We've tried threatening her. Nothing has worked. She's absolutely determined to turn us in. David, maybe we could try to have her declared mentally incompetent, get her committed to a psychiatric facility where no one would believe her accusations. Thomas, that won't work. She's too coherent, too organized, too obviously sane. Any competent psychiatrist would see through that approach immediately. Jennifer, besides, she's already assembled too much evidence. Even if we discredited her personally, the evidence would still exist. Thomas, then we need to eliminate both problems, Margaret and the evidence she's collected. David, you're talking about killing our own mother. Jennifer, we killed our own father, David. This is exactly the same situation. Someone who's threatening to destroy us needs to be stopped permanently. Thomas, how would we do it? It has to look completely natural. Heart attack, stroke, something that wouldn't raise any suspicions. Jennifer, I can get the drugs we need. The right combination of sedatives and cardiac medications would stop her heart without leaving obvious traces. It would appear to be natural death from old age. David, when? Thomas, Tuesday morning. Margaret follows the same routine every day. She has her morning tea while reading the financial newspapers. If we put the drugs in her tea, she'll lose consciousness gradually, and her heart will stop within an hour. Jennifer, what about the evidence? We need to search the apartment and find everything she's collected. Documents, recordings, copies she might have hidden. Thomas, we'll have time for that while the drugs are taking effect. Margaret will be unconscious but still alive for 30 to 40 minutes, giving us time to search the apartment thoroughly. David, this is insane. We're talking about murdering our mother. Thomas, we're talking about protecting our families, our businesses, our charitable foundations, and our freedom. Margaret has forced this choice on us by threatening to destroy everything we've built. Jennifer, David, if we don't act, we'll spend the rest of our lives in prison. Our children will grow up knowing their parents are murderers. Our spouses will be destroyed by scandal. Hundreds of employees will lose their jobs. Thousands of people who benefit from our charitable work will suffer. Thomas, Margaret is 86 years old, David. She's had a full life. If we don't stop her, she'll destroy the lives of everyone connected to our family. David, how do we get into her apartment? Jennifer, Thomas still has a key from when we were helping her with household management. We'll enter Monday night after she's asleep, prepare her morning tea with the drugs, then wait for her to drink it, Tuesday morning. Thomas, what about alibis? Jennifer, we'll all be at Thomas's house in the Hamptons for a family dinner Monday evening. Multiple witnesses, household staff, security cameras. We'll establish our presence there, then drive back to the city after midnight when everyone's asleep. Thomas, the timing works perfectly. Margaret has her tea at 7 a.m. every Tuesday. The drugs will take effect by 7:30, and she'll be dead before 8 o'clock. We'll be back in the Hamptons before anyone notices we're gone. David, what if someone suspects foul play? Jennifer, who would suspect anything? An 86-year-old woman dying peacefully in her chair while reading the newspaper. It's exactly what everyone would expect to happen eventually. Thomas, the key is making sure we find all the evidence she's collected. Documents, recordings, copies she might have made. Everything has to be destroyed before the police get involved. The recording continued for another 10 minutes, with the three siblings working out additional details of their plan to murder their mother and destroy the evidence of their previous crime. They discussed backup plans, contingencies for unexpected complications, and how they would behave when questioned by police about their mother's death. It was a complete roadmap to murder, recorded by the intended victim and preserved as evidence that would ultimately convict her killers. Patterson had heard enough confessions during his career to recognize authenticity, and this wasn't speculation or circumstantial evidence. This was 3 people planning their mother's murder in methodical detail, captured on digital audio that would be impossible for any defense attorney to explain away. Ms. Mitchell, this evidence is absolutely devastating. Why didn't Margaret take it to the police immediately, instead of waiting for her meeting with the DA? She wanted to have everything perfectly organized and documented before she made her accusations. Margaret was terrified that if she went to the police prematurely, her children would use their wealth and connections to make the evidence disappear and discredit her as a paranoid old woman. She was probably right about that. Wealthy suspects often have resources to interfere with investigations, especially in the early stages when evidence is being collected and evaluated. Mitchell nodded grimly. Margaret understood that she would only get one chance to expose her children's crimes. If she failed, they would kill her and destroy all the evidence. She wanted to make sure her case was absolutely bulletproof before she presented it to authorities. Unfortunately, waiting for perfect evidence cost her her life, but at least she managed to preserve enough proof to convict her murderers. Patterson spent the rest of the day working with prosecutors from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office to obtain arrest warrants for Thomas, David, and Jennifer Whitmore. The charges included murder in the first degree for Margaret's death, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud related to their father's death, and multiple other felonies that could result in life sentences without possibility of parole. The evidence was overwhelming. Audio recordings of the siblings planning both murders, toxicology evidence proving that Margaret had been poisoned, financial records showing clear motives for both crimes, and engineering reports proving that Robert Whitmore's death had been caused by sabotage rather than accident. But prosecuting 3 wealthy, prominent members of Manhattan society would require careful coordination and extensive resources. The Whitmore family had connections throughout the legal and political systems, access to the best defense attorneys money could buy, and the financial resources to mount a vigorous defense that could drag on for years. The arrests were coordinated to take place simultaneously early on Thursday morning, preventing any of the siblings from warning the others or attempting to flee the country. Thomas was arrested at his office in Midtown Manhattan by FBI agents and uniformed officers who surrounded the building to prevent escape. David was taken into custody at his apartment in Greenwich Village, where agents found him packing suitcases with cash and what appeared to be false identification documents. Jennifer was apprehended at her art gallery in Soho, where she was in the process of liquidating valuable artwork that could have provided funding for extended flight from prosecution. All 3 were charged with multiple counts of murder and held without bail due to the severity of the charges and the substantial risk that they would flee the jurisdiction. The media attention was immediate and intense. The Whitmore name had been synonymous with New York high society for over a century, and seeing 3 members of the family led away in handcuffs for murdering their parents was the kind of scandal that dominated news coverage for months. The trial that followed was a media circus that exposed the darkest aspects of Manhattan's elite society. Defense attorneys representing the siblings tried every possible strategy to avoid conviction. They claimed the audio recordings had been fabricated by Margaret in her declining mental state. They argued that she had been suffering from advanced dementia and paranoid delusions. They suggested that her death had actually been suicide, committed by a mentally ill woman who wanted to frame her children for murder. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that Margaret had shown signs of age-related paranoia. They hired audio experts who claimed the recordings could have been edited or manipulated. They presented character witnesses who described the defendants as loving children, who had devoted their lives to charitable work and family responsibilities. But the evidence against the Whitmore siblings was simply overwhelming. The audio recordings were authenticated by multiple independent experts who testified that they were genuine, unedited, and accurately represented the conversations that had taken place. The toxicology evidence proved conclusively that Margaret had been murdered using sophisticated pharmaceutical knowledge. The financial evidence showed clear motives for both murders: the siblings' desperate need for money in 2009 and their need to silence their mother in 2024. Most damaging of all was the technical evidence about Robert Whitmore's death. Marine engineering experts testified that the yacht explosion had been caused by a sophisticated improvised explosive device, not by accidental gas leak. Insurance investigators revealed that the original claim had been processed with unusual speed and minimal investigation, suggesting possible corruption or intimidation. Even weather and tide records from the day of Robert's death contradicted key elements of the siblings' alibis in their account of that day's events. Patterson testified for 4 days about his investigation, walking the jury through his discovery of evidence step by step. He described the crime scene at Margaret's apartment, the signs that someone had searched for and removed important documents, the journal entries that revealed Margaret's growing fear of her own children, and the systematic way the evidence pointed toward a family conspiracy that had lasted 15 years. He also testified about the recordings, playing key segments for the jury, and explaining how they revealed the defendant's guilt in both murders. The jury listened in stunned silence as they heard Thomas, David, and Jennifer Whitmore planning their mother's death with the same cold calculation they might use to plan a business transaction. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Financial experts showed how the insurance money from Robert's death had been used to solve each sibling's desperate financial problems. Medical experts explained how Margaret had been killed using drugs that required sophisticated knowledge to obtain and administer properly. Engineering experts demonstrated how the yacht explosion had been caused by deliberate sabotage using techniques that were consistent with David's marine knowledge and Thomas's engineering background. But perhaps most powerful was the testimony of Linda Mitchell, the private investigator who had worked with Margaret to uncover the truth about Robert's death. Mitchell spent 3 days on the witness stand, methodically presenting 8 months of investigation that had revealed a pattern of murder, deception, and cover-up spanning 15 years. She showed the jury photographs, financial records, insurance documents, and interview transcripts that painted a clear picture of 3 people who had murdered their father for money, lived comfortably on the proceeds for 15 years, then murdered their mother to prevent her from exposing their original crime. The defense attorneys fought vigorously, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer volume and quality of evidence against their clients. They tried to create reasonable doubt by suggesting alternative theories: that Robert's death really had been accidental, that Margaret had committed suicide, that the recordings had been fabricated by a mentally ill woman seeking revenge against her family. But every alternative theory was contradicted by physical evidence, expert testimony, or the defendant's own recorded words. The case against the Whitmore siblings was airtight, supported by multiple forms of evidence and expert analysis that left no room for reasonable doubt about their guilt. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Thomas Whitmore was convicted of 2 counts of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. David received the same sentence despite his attorney's arguments that he had been a reluctant participant who was dominated by his more aggressive siblings. Jennifer was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy charges that carried a death sentence, though her sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment when New York State abolished capital punishment. The Whitmore family empire collapsed completely in the aftermath of the convictions. Legal fees, victim compensation, civil judgments, and asset forfeiture consumed most of the family's wealth. Real estate holdings were sold to pay debts and legal expenses. The charitable foundations they had established were disbanded after investigators discovered that much of their funding had come from the proceeds of Robert Whitmore's murder. The Park Avenue penthouse where Margaret had lived and died was sold and converted into luxury condominiums. The family's name disappeared from New York society pages and charitable organization donor lists. Within 2 years of the convictions, there was virtually no trace left of what had once been one of Manhattan's most prominent and wealthy families. For Patterson, the case remained a profound reminder of how wealth and privilege could corrupt families from within, turning children against parents and reducing human relationships to financial calculations. The Whitmore siblings had grown up with every advantage that money could provide: private schools, elite universities, social connections, trust funds, opportunities that most people could never imagine. But instead of using their advantages to build meaningful lives and contribute to society, they had learned to see their parents as obstacles to their financial security. When Robert Whitmore had refused to solve their self-created financial problems, they had decided he was expendable. When Margaret had threatened to expose their crime 15 years later, they had made the same calculation about their mother. 2 murders committed by children against their own parents, both motivated by nothing more than greed and the desire to avoid consequences for their own poor decisions and illegal activities. The coldness with which they had planned both deaths, the casual way they had discussed murdering the people who had given them life and opportunity, spoke to a level of moral corruption that went far beyond ordinary criminal behavior. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of elderly wealthy people, even those who took extraordinary precautions to protect themselves. Margaret Whitmore had been suspicious of her children's motives, had hired professional investigators, had documented their crimes meticulously, had even recorded their plans to kill her. But in the end, the people she had trusted most, her own children, had been the ones who murdered her. Her courage in pursuing justice for her husband's murder, even knowing that it would probably cost her own life, had ultimately made the convictions possible. The recordings she had made, the evidence she had preserved, the investigation she had funded had reached across the grave to ensure that her murderers were finally brought to justice. During the penalty phase of the trial, Patterson testified about the impact the murders had on the community and on law enforcement's ability to protect elderly victims of family violence. He talked about the resources that had been devoted to what initially appeared to be a natural death, the complex investigation required to uncover a 15-year-old conspiracy, and the way the case had challenged his assumptions about the bonds that were supposed to exist between parents and children. But he also talked about Margaret Whitmore's remarkable determination to see justice done, even at the cost of her own life. Her refusal to be intimidated by her children's threats, her insistence on documenting their crimes, her willingness to confront them directly with evidence of their guilt, had made their convictions possible. Margaret Whitmore died because she believed that murder should not go unpunished, regardless of who committed it or how much money they had to spend on covering it up, Patterson told the court during his testimony. Her courage in pursuing justice, even when that pursuit put her own life at risk, ensured that her husband's murder was finally acknowledged and that her children could not profit indefinitely from their crimes. The case became required study material at police academies and law schools across the country, used to teach investigators about recognizing staged crime scenes, conducting thorough interviews with wealthy suspects, and understanding that financial motives for murder could persist for years or decades after the original crime. Patterson was invited to speak about the investigation at law enforcement conferences and training seminars, sharing the techniques he had used to uncover evidence of a conspiracy that had been hidden for 15 years. He emphasized the importance of thorough crime scene analysis, careful examination of physical evidence, and the need to consider financial motives when investigating deaths involving wealthy families. But for Patterson personally, the Whitmore case was most significant as a reminder that evil could exist anywhere, in any family, behind any facade of respectability and wealth. Every time he responded to calls involving elderly deaths with wealthy relatives, he thought about Margaret Whitmore and the evidence she had hidden throughout her apartment. Every time he interviewed family members who seemed more concerned with inheritance than with grief, he remembered the cold calculation with which the Whitmore siblings had planned their mother's death. Every time he encountered suspects who believed their money and social status made them untouchable, he thought about Thomas, David, and Jennifer Whitmore sitting in prison cells, serving life sentences for murdering the people who had loved them most. 3 years after the convictions, Patterson was promoted to detective and assigned to the Major Case Squad, where he specialized in complex investigations involving wealthy families and sophisticated financial crimes. The skills he had developed during the Whitmore investigation, patience, attention to detail, skepticism about surface appearances, and the ability to follow financial evidence across multiple years and jurisdictions, served him well in cases where money and power were used to conceal criminal activity. He never forgot the lessons Margaret Whitmore had taught him about the importance of listening to victims, even when those victims could only speak through evidence they had left behind. Her meticulous documentation, her hidden recordings, her refusal to be silenced by threats or intimidation had made justice possible in a case that could easily have been dismissed as natural death. The case was officially closed, but its impact on Patterson's approach to investigations would last for the rest of his career. He had learned that money didn't make people better or worse. It just gave them more resources to act on their true nature. And sometimes that true nature was far darker than anyone wanted to admit. The Whitmore case had started as a routine welfare check and evolved into one of the most complex murder investigations in NYPD history. It had exposed crimes spanning 15 years, involved millions of dollars in insurance fraud, and ultimately resulted in life sentences for 3 people who had thought their wealth and connections made them immune to the consequences of murder. But for Patterson, the case would always be remembered as the story of an elderly woman who had refused to let her husband's murder go unpunished, even when seeking justice meant confronting her own children and ultimately sacrificing her own life. Margaret Whitmore had paid the ultimate price for her pursuit of truth, but her courage and determination had ensured that justice was finally served. The Whitmore name had once been synonymous with Manhattan high society, charitable giving, and business success. After the trial, it became synonymous with greed, murder, and the ultimate corruption of family bonds by wealth and selfishness. The family that had once been celebrated in society pages was now studied in criminology textbooks as an example of how privilege and money could create monsters. Sometimes justice comes from courtrooms and legal proceedings. Sometimes it comes from careful police work and thorough investigations. And sometimes, as Patterson had learned from the Whitmore case, justice comes from victims who refuse to stay silent, even after death. Margaret Whitmore's voice had reached across the grave to convict her killers, ensuring that 15 years of lies, cover-ups, and murder were finally brought to an end. Officer William Thompson thought he'd seen every kind of insurance scam during his 12 years working Brooklyn streets. Fake slip and falls, staged rear-end collisions, elaborate medical fraud schemes. All of it designed to milk insurance companies for easy money. But the case that started with a routine traffic accident on Fulton Street would expose a network so sophisticated and brutal that it changed everything Thompson thought he knew about organized crime in New York. The call came through dispatch at 9:23 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday morning in early March. three-car accident at the intersection of Fulton and Bedford. Multiple injuries reported. Ambulances requested. Thompson had been patrolling the Bedford-Stuyvesant area for 6 years, and he knew that intersection well. Poor visibility during bad weather, aggressive drivers running lights to beat the change, and the constant mix of commercial delivery trucks and residential traffic created perfect conditions for accidents. But as Thompson arrived on scene and began taking statements from the involved parties, details emerged that didn't quite fit the familiar pattern of Brooklyn traffic accidents. The driver of the sedan, a woman who identified herself as Amanda Roberts, was clearly in distress. She was holding her neck with both hands, complaining of severe back pain, and requesting immediate medical attention in a voice that was shaking with what appeared to be genuine fear. She claimed she'd had the green light when the delivery truck T-boned her vehicle, and she seemed authentically shaken by the violence of the collision. Her passenger, a man named Christopher Williams, was also claiming significant injuries. He was holding his head and complaining of severe headaches, dizziness, and blurred vision that he said had started immediately after impact. Both passengers were describing symptoms consistent with serious whiplash and potential concussion. Exactly the kinds of injuries that would justify extensive medical treatment and substantial insurance claims. The truck driver, Michael Davis, told a completely different story. He insisted with obvious sincerity that he'd had the green light, that the sedan had run the red and caused the entire accident. Davis seemed genuinely distraught about the collision, apologizing repeatedly to the injured parties, even though he maintained that the accident wasn't his fault. What bothered Thompson from the very beginning was something subtle about the behavior of the supposedly injured parties. Instead of being angry at the truck driver or upset about their damaged vehicle, Amanda and Christopher seemed almost prepared for what was happening. They had specific questions about the accident report that most genuine accident victims wouldn't think to ask. They requested detailed information about insurance claim procedures with a familiarity that suggested previous experience. Most telling, they already had the names and phone numbers of personal injury attorneys written down on pieces of paper they produced from their wallets within minutes of the collision. Thompson had dealt with enough legitimate accident victims to know that most people were either too shaken to think about legal representation immediately, or they asked friends and family for referrals to attorneys they trusted. Having contact information for multiple personal injury lawyers ready immediately after an accident suggested a level of preparation that was suspicious. Even more concerning was the timing and specificity of their medical response. Before Thompson had even finished taking their statements, Amanda was on her cell phone with someone she identified as her doctor, providing a detailed description of her injuries and symptoms. She was scheduling an immediate appointment at a clinic in Crown Heights, and she seemed to know exactly what kinds of tests and treatments she would need. Christopher was making similar calls, speaking with medical providers about specific diagnostic procedures and treatment protocols with a familiarity that suggested this wasn't his first experience with accident-related injuries. Most genuine accident victims Thompson had encountered were either too shocked to think about medical care immediately, or they went to emergency rooms and let medical professionals determine what treatment was needed. The damaged vehicles told their own story, and it wasn't entirely consistent with the accounts provided by the drivers. Thompson had investigated hundreds of traffic accidents during his career, and he'd developed an instinct for distinguishing between genuine collision damage and damage that might have been staged, enhanced, or misrepresented. The sedan's damage looked slightly wrong for a vehicle that had been T-boned at the speed the drivers claimed. The impact patterns were too clean, too localized to specific areas of the vehicle, without the chaotic secondary damage that typically resulted from high-speed collisions. Most T-bone accidents created complex damage patterns as vehicles spun, rolled, or collided with other objects after the initial impact. More suspicious was the condition of the delivery truck, For a vehicle that had allegedly caused such a severe accident, resulting in serious injuries to 2 people, the truck showed remarkably minimal damage. A few dents and scratches on the front bumper and side panel, but nothing that suggested the kind of high-speed impact that would cause the whiplash and head injuries that Amanda and Christopher were claiming. Thompson had seen enough legitimate accidents to know that the physics didn't match the claimed injuries. Either the collision had been much less severe than the participants were claiming, or the damage had been minimized somehow to make the truck driver appear less at fault while maximizing the apparent injuries to the sedan's occupants. He made detailed notes about the inconsistencies, took extensive photographs of the accident scene and all the vehicles involved, and requested that both damaged vehicles be towed to the police impound lot for further examination. Most insurance fraud attempts turned out to be relatively small-scale scams run by desperate people looking for quick money, but something about this particular accident felt more organized and professional. The first major red flag emerged when Thompson tried to verify the insurance information provided by the drivers. Amanda Roberts had given him a policy card for a company called Tri-State Mutual Insurance, but when he called the customer service number on the card, he reached a disconnected voicemail system. The physical address listed on the insurance card led to a vacant office building in Queens that had been empty for over a year, according to the building management company. Christopher Williams' insurance information had similar problems. The company name on his card matched a legitimate insurance provider, but the policy number didn't correspond to any active policies in their system. When Thompson called the insurance company directly and spoke with a fraud investigator, they confirmed that the policy number had been altered and that they had no record of Christopher Williams as a current or former policyholder. Even more concerning was Michael Davis, the truck driver who initially seemed like an innocent victim of a red light runner. His insurance information checked out, and his employer confirmed that he was a legitimate employee with a clean driving record. But when Thompson spoke with Davis's supervisor at Metropolitan Transport, he learned some disturbing details about Davis's recent employment history. Davis had been involved in 3 other traffic accidents over the past 8 months, all of them following remarkably similar patterns. In each case, Davis had been driving his delivery truck when another vehicle had allegedly caused an accident by running a red light or making an illegal turn. In each case, the other vehicle's occupants had claimed serious injuries requiring extensive medical treatment. In each case, the insurance companies had settled the claims quickly and quietly rather than fighting them in court. Thompson was beginning to suspect that Michael Davis wasn't an innocent truck driver who'd been unlucky enough to encounter multiple reckless drivers. He was starting to look like a key player in a coordinated insurance fraud scheme that used his commercial vehicle and high-coverage insurance policy to generate substantial fraudulent claims. The medical records painted an even more disturbing picture. Amanda Roberts and Christopher Williams had both been treated at a clinic in Crown Heights called Brooklyn Medical Associates, which specialized in accident-related injuries and rehabilitation services. The clinic was owned and operated by a doctor named Thomas Anderson, who had built a thriving practice treating victims of traffic accidents, workplace injuries, and other trauma-related conditions. When Thompson visited Brooklyn Medical Associates to gather information about the treatment provided to Amanda and Christopher, he found a busy operation with a steady stream of patients who all seemed to be suffering from remarkably similar injuries. The waiting room was filled with people complaining of neck pain, back problems, headaches, and other symptoms that were difficult to verify objectively but that could justify months of expensive treatment programs. Dr. Anderson was smooth and professional when Thompson interviewed him, but evasive when asked direct questions about his treatment protocols and his relationships with personal injury attorneys in the area. Anderson claimed that the high number of accident victims he treated was simply the result of his clinic's reputation for excellent care and successful outcomes. But Thompson noticed that virtually all of the patients in the waiting room were young, healthy-looking people who showed no obvious signs of serious injury or disability. The financial records for Brooklyn Medical Associates told a more troubling story. Over the past 2 years, the clinic had filed insurance claims totaling over $4 million for accident-related treatments. The claims were consistently for injuries that required long-term physical therapy, multiple diagnostic tests, and expensive procedures that generated substantial billing, but didn't require hospital admissions or surgical interventions that would create permanent medical records. Thompson was looking at a sophisticated medical fraud operation that used staged accidents to generate a steady stream of patients, who were then treated for exaggerated or entirely fabricated injuries that justified massive insurance payouts. But the scale and organization of the scheme suggested something much larger than a single corrupt doctor working with a few desperate patients. His investigation expanded when he discovered that Amanda Roberts and Christopher Williams had extensive histories of involvement in similar accidents over the past 2 years. Using different vehicles, different locations, and different insurance companies, but always following the same basic pattern. They were passengers or drivers in accidents that resulted in substantial injury claims and insurance settlements that were paid out quickly to avoid lengthy investigations. Amanda Roberts alone had been involved in 9 separate traffic accidents over the past 20 months, collecting insurance settlements and medical payments totaling over $300,000. She had been treated by dozens of different medical providers across Brooklyn and Queens, always for injuries that were difficult to verify but that required extensive and expensive treatment programs. Christopher Williams had an even more extensive history, with 14 documented accidents and insurance payouts exceeding $400,000 over the same time period. He had been treated by medical providers throughout the New York metropolitan area, and his claimed injuries had become progressively more severe and costly to treat as he gained experience in the fraud network. These weren't accident victims who had been unlucky enough to be injured multiple times. They were professional insurance fraud participants who made their living by staging collisions and faking injuries with the systematic precision of any other criminal enterprise. Thompson's investigation took a more dangerous turn when he tried to interview Amanda Roberts at the address she had provided on her insurance documents. The apartment building existed, but the superintendent told him that no one by that name had ever lived there. The apartment number Amanda had given corresponded to a unit that had been vacant for over 6 months, and the building's management company had no record of anyone matching her description ever applying for tenancy. Christopher Williams' address led to similar results. The street address was real, but it belonged to a commercial laundry facility that had been operating at that location for over 20 years. No residential units, no tenants, no record of anyone named Christopher Williams ever having any connection to the property. Both accident participants had provided completely false identification and had disappeared immediately after giving their statements to Thompson. They had vanished so thoroughly that he was beginning to wonder if Amanda Roberts and Christopher Williams were even their real names, or if they were using sophisticated false identities as part of their participation in the fraud network. But Thompson had one solid lead left: Michael Davis, the truck driver who appeared to be a central figure in multiple staged accidents over the past several months. Davis worked for Metropolitan Transport, a legitimate delivery company that operated out of a warehouse complex in Sunset Park. When Thompson arrived at the company's headquarters to interview Davis more thoroughly, he found what appeared to be a normal commercial operation with dozens of trucks and drivers engaged in routine delivery services throughout Brooklyn and Queens. Davis himself was more cooperative than Thompson had expected, agreeing to a detailed interview and seeming genuinely concerned about the accusations that were being made against him. He appeared confused and frightened by the suggestion that he might be involved in insurance fraud, and his reactions seemed authentic rather than calculated. "Officer Thompson, I swear on my mother's grave that I had no idea those accidents were being staged, Davis said, sitting in the break room of the delivery company with his supervisor present as a witness. I thought I was just having the worst run of bad luck in driving history. You know how Brooklyn traffic is. People run red lights constantly. Nobody pays attention to what they're doing. Accidents happen all the time. Michael, you've been involved in 4 accidents in 8 months, all following the exact same pattern. That's not bad luck, that's a statistical impossibility. Davis looked genuinely puzzled and increasingly frightened as the implications of Thompson's questions became clear to him. Are you saying that someone was deliberately causing these accidents? That the other drivers were trying to get hit by my truck on purpose? Thompson studied Davis's face and body language carefully throughout their conversation. Either the man was an exceptionally talented actor, or he was genuinely unaware of his role in the insurance fraud scheme. His confusion seemed authentic, and his fear appeared to be the result of realizing he'd been used and manipulated rather than the fear of someone who was about to be caught committing deliberate crimes. Michael, I need you to think very carefully about your accidents. Were there any similarities in how they happened? Any patterns you might have noticed that seemed unusual? Davis was quiet for several minutes, clearly thinking through the events that had shaped his recent experiences. Actually, now that you mention it, there were some strange things that I didn't think much about at the time. In every accident, the other drivers seemed to know exactly what to do after the collision, who to call, which medical facilities to go to, which lawyers to contact, like they'd been through the process before and knew all the steps. What else struck you as unusual? The accidents all happened in the same general area of Brooklyn, within a few miles of each other. Different streets and intersections, but all in neighborhoods where I was making regular delivery runs. At the time, I thought it was just coincidence because that's where I spend most of my driving time, but now it seems like maybe someone was studying my roads. Thompson felt pieces of the puzzle starting to come together in his mind. The accidents weren't random events that happened to involve the same truck driver. They were carefully orchestrated operations that took place in specific locations where the participants could control the timing, circumstances, and aftermath of the collisions. Michael, the other drivers in your accidents, did they seem genuinely injured, or was there anything about their behavior that seemed unusual? That's another thing that struck me as odd. Most people who get hurt in car accidents are either really shaken up or really angry, right? But these people seemed almost businesslike about the whole thing. They were focused on documenting everything, getting contact information, making sure all the paperwork was filled out correctly. It was like they were treating the accident as a business transaction rather than a traumatic experience. Davis's observations confirmed Thompson's suspicions that the accidents had been staged by people with extensive experience in insurance fraud. The participants knew exactly how to maximize their claims while minimizing the evidence that might suggest fraud, and they had practiced their responses to the point where they could execute them smoothly, even immediately after a supposedly traumatic collision. Michael, I believe you when you say you didn't know these accidents were staged, but I need your help to understand how this network operates and who's running it. If you cooperate with the investigation, I can make sure you're treated as a victim rather than a perpetrator. Davis agreed immediately to help Thompson uncover the fraud network, providing detailed information about each accident and helping to identify patterns that weren't obvious from the official reports alone. What emerged from their extended conversations was a picture of a sophisticated criminal organization that had been operating for years, generating millions of dollars in fraudulent insurance claims through a combination of staged accidents, corrupt medical providers, and unethical legal representation. The network operated with the efficiency and organization of a legitimate business. Professional accident participants like Amanda Roberts and Christopher Williams were recruited from economically disadvantaged communities and trained to convincingly fake injuries and navigate the insurance claims process. They were paid a few $1,000s for each staged accident they participated in, which represented substantial income for people who had limited opportunities for legitimate employment. Legitimate truck drivers like Michael Davis were targeted and manipulated because their commercial vehicle insurance policies had high coverage limits that made them attractive targets for large settlements. The network's organizers studied driver routes and schedules to identify optimal locations and timing for staged accidents, then used their trained participants to execute collisions that would appear accidental to responding police officers and insurance investigators. Medical providers like Dr. Thomas Anderson were recruited to provide unnecessary treatments and inflated billing that justified the insurance claims. These corrupt doctors performed expensive diagnostic tests that weren't medically necessary, prescribed extended treatment programs that didn't improve patient outcomes, and documented symptoms and disabilities that didn't actually exist. Personal injury attorneys completed the fraud network by taking accident cases on contingency, filing lawsuits against insurance companies, and negotiating settlements that were based on fabricated or exaggerated injuries. These lawyers collected substantial fees when insurance companies chose to settle questionable claims rather than spending even more money fighting them in court. But as Thompson dug deeper into the network's operations, he discovered that the organization had a much darker side than simple financial fraud. The people running the scheme used systematic intimidation and violence to maintain control over participants and silence anyone who threatened to expose the operation. This became clear when Thompson tried to interview other truck drivers who had been involved in similar suspicious accidents over the past 2 years. Several drivers told him they had received explicit threats of physical violence if they cooperated with police investigations or spoke with insurance company fraud investigators. One driver, a man named David Johnson, had been hospitalized after being severely beaten by unknown assailants who warned him to keep quiet about his accident experiences. Another driver, a woman named Jennifer Martinez, had received death threats against her family after she began questioning whether some of her accidents had been legitimate. Someone had called her at home repeatedly, describing her children's daily routines in detail, and warning her that accidents could happen to family members if she continued asking inconvenient questions about her collision experiences. Thompson realized he wasn't just investigating insurance fraud. He was dealing with a violent criminal organization that used systematic terror tactics to protect a multi-million-dollar operation. The stakes were much higher than he had initially understood, and the people running the network were prepared to seriously hurt or kill anyone who threatened their profits. The investigation took an even more dangerous turn when Thompson tried to examine the physical evidence from the staged accidents. When he went to the police impound lot to inspect Amanda Roberts' sedan, he discovered that the vehicle had been removed without authorization, despite his explicit instructions that it was being held as evidence in an active investigation. The paperwork showed that the car had been released to a towing company called Metropolitan Recovery Services, but when Thompson tried to contact that company, he found that it didn't exist. The business license was fake, the address was a vacant lot, and the authorization forms had been forged using stolen police department letterhead and signatures. Someone with detailed knowledge of police procedures and access to official documentation had stolen evidence from an active investigation. Thompson was dealing with a criminal organization that had infiltrated law enforcement systems, giving them the ability to interfere with investigations and destroy evidence that could expose their operations. The breakthrough in the case came when Thompson received an unexpected phone call from a woman who identified herself as Sarah Peterson. She said she had worked for the people who were running the staged accident network, but she was afraid to meet with police in person because she had been threatened with violence for trying to leave the organization. Officer Thompson, I used to be one of the people who participated in fake accidents for these people. I know how the whole operation works, who's in charge, how they recruit people, how they stage the accidents, how they threaten anyone who tries to get out or cooperate with law enforcement. Why are you calling me now, Miss Peterson? Because they hurt someone I care about, and I can't let them keep doing this to innocent people. My younger brother was one of their truck drivers, like your Michael Davis. When he started asking too many questions about his accidents and talking about going to the police, they beat him so badly that he's still in the hospital with brain damage. The doctors don't know if he'll ever fully recover. Thompson arranged to meet Sarah at a secure location, a police facility in Queens that was far from any area where the insurance fraud network might have surveillance or sources of information. What Sarah told him during their 4-hour interview completely changed his understanding of the criminal organization he was investigating. The network was run by a man named Thomas Wilson, who operated out of what appeared to be a legitimate insurance brokerage firm in downtown Brooklyn. Wilson had spent over 15 years working in the insurance industry before transitioning into fraud, learning how claims were processed, how investigations were conducted, and how to exploit weaknesses in the system to generate massive, fraudulent payouts. Wilson had recruited a team of corrupt professionals throughout Brooklyn and Queens, doctors like Thomas Anderson, personal injury lawyers, auto body shop owners, towing company operators, and even employees within police departments and insurance companies who helped facilitate the staged accidents and ensure that investigations were misdirected or abandoned before they could expose the network. The financial scope of Wilson's operation was staggering. According to Sarah's information, the network had generated over $12 million in fraudulent insurance claims over the past 3 years, with profits distributed among the various participants according to their roles and level of involvement. Wilson himself was making over $3 million annually from the scheme, while lower-level participants like the fake accident victims were paid only a few $1,000s for each staged collision they participated in. But the most disturbing aspect of Wilson's operation was his use of systematic violence to maintain control over the network. Sarah told Thompson about multiple people who had been severely beaten, threatened, or even killed because they had tried to leave the organization or cooperate with law enforcement investigations. Wilson doesn't just run an insurance fraud scheme, Sarah explained, her voice shaking with fear even in the secure police facility. He runs it like a criminal empire. People who cross him or threaten to expose him don't just lose their jobs, they end up in the hospital or the morgue. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about power and control over everyone involved. Sarah provided Thompson with detailed information about Wilson's methods of recruitment, the training process for new accident participants, the medical providers who were part of the network, and the lawyers who filed fraudulent lawsuits on behalf of fake victims. She also gave him specific information about at least 6 people who had been killed because they had posed threats to Wilson's operation. The victims included former participants who had tried to leave the organization, insurance investigators who had gotten too close to discovering the truth, and even some of Wilson's own associates who he suspected of cooperating with law enforcement. The murders had been carried out by professional criminals who specialized in making deaths appear accidental or coincidental, using methods that rarely attracted police attention or generated serious investigations. Working with federal authorities who had jurisdiction over insurance fraud crimes, Thompson began building a comprehensive case against Wilson's network. The FBI brought in agents who specialized in organized crime and financial fraud, providing resources and authority that local police couldn't access, including the ability to conduct extensive surveillance operations and financial investigations that would expose the full scope of Wilson's criminal enterprise. Over the course of 8 months, federal agents used wiretaps to record conversations between Wilson and his associates, conducted financial investigations that traced the movement of fraudulent insurance payments through multiple bank accounts and shell companies, and documented staged accidents in progress using sophisticated surveillance techniques. The evidence that emerged revealed a criminal organization that was far more extensive and dangerous than Thompson had initially imagined. Wilson's network included corrupt police officers who provided advance warning about investigations, judges who dismissed cases against network participants, insurance company employees who expedited fraudulent claim payments, and medical professionals who provided false documentation to support fabricated injury claims. The network had also expanded beyond staged auto accidents to include other forms of insurance fraud. They were filing fake disability claims for people who weren't actually disabled, committing arson to collect property insurance payouts, and even operating life insurance schemes that involved murdering policyholders to collect death benefits on their behalf. But the most shocking discovery was the extent of violence Wilson had used to protect his operation from law enforcement and maintain control over participants. Federal investigators found evidence of at least 9 murders committed specifically to silence people who had threatened to expose the network. The victims included former accident participants who had tried to cooperate with police, insurance investigators who had developed leads that could have exposed the operation, and even some of Wilson's own business partners who he suspected of disloyalty. The coordinated raids and arrests took place on a single day in November, with federal agents and local police executing search warrants simultaneously at dozens of locations across Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan. Wilson was arrested at his insurance brokerage office, where agents found detailed records of fraudulent operations, including lists of participants, payment schedules, and what appeared to be a target list of people who had been marked for elimination because they posed threats to the network. Dr. Thomas Anderson was arrested at Brooklyn Medical Associates, where agents found evidence of treatments that had never actually been performed, and medical records that had been completely fabricated to justify insurance claims. Several personal injury attorneys were arrested at their offices and charged with filing fraudulent lawsuits and knowingly presenting false evidence in court proceedings. Michael Davis, the truck driver who had unknowingly participated in the staged accidents, was not charged with any crimes. Instead, he became a key witness for the prosecution, testifying about how he had been manipulated and used by the network without understanding what was really happening to him. Amanda Roberts and Christopher Williams, the professional accident participants, were eventually tracked down and arrested at a motel in New Jersey, where they had been planning additional staged accidents. Faced with evidence of their extensive participation in the fraud network and potential charges that could result in decades in prison, they agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. The trial that followed lasted over a year and involved more than 200 witnesses, making it one of the largest insurance fraud prosecutions in New York history. Thompson testified for 5 days about his investigation, describing how a routine traffic accident had led to the discovery of a violent, criminal organization that had stolen millions of dollars and killed people to protect its profits. Thomas Wilson was convicted on charges including conspiracy, insurance fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and multiple counts of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Dozens of other participants in the network received sentences ranging from 5 to 25 years in federal prison, depending on their level of involvement and cooperation with the investigation. The insurance companies that had been defrauded recovered most of their losses through asset forfeiture proceedings, but the human cost of Wilson's operation couldn't be measured in financial terms. 9 people had been murdered to protect the scheme. Dozens of others had been threatened and beaten into submission, and hundreds of legitimate accident victims had been harmed by increased insurance rates and skeptical treatment of genuine injury claims. For Thompson, the case was a sobering reminder that insurance fraud wasn't just a white-collar crime that affected faceless corporations. It was often connected to violent criminal organizations that would kill to protect their profits. And it had real consequences for ordinary people who depended on insurance systems to help them recover from legitimate accidents and injuries. The investigation also highlighted how sophisticated criminal organizations could exploit legitimate businesses and infrastructure to facilitate their illegal activities. Companies like Metropolitan Transport had been used as unwitting participants in fraudulent schemes, their normal business operations manipulated by criminals who understood how to turn routine commercial activities into opportunities for fraud. 6 months after Wilson's conviction, Thompson received a letter from Sarah Peterson, the former network participant whose cooperation had been crucial to breaking up the insurance fraud operation. She wrote to thank him for taking her information seriously and for protecting her identity throughout the investigation and trial. Officer Thompson, I know my brother will never fully recover from what Wilson's people did to him when he tried to get out of their organization. But at least they can't hurt anyone else now. And maybe other people who get trapped in situations like this will have the courage to come forward, knowing that the police will believe them and protect them. Thompson kept Sarah's letter as a reminder of why police work mattered, even when it involved complex financial crimes that might seem abstract compared to more obvious forms of violence. Behind every fraud investigation were real people who had been victimized by criminals, and sometimes the most important part of police work was simply listening to witnesses who had the courage to come forward despite personal risks. The case also changed Thompson's understanding of how organized crime operated in modern urban environments. Wilson's network had used sophisticated technology, legitimate business fronts, and corruption within legal and medical systems to generate millions of dollars in illegal profits while maintaining a facade of respectability that protected them from casual scrutiny. The insurance fraud network had been dismantled, but Thompson knew that similar organizations were probably operating throughout the metropolitan area. The methods Wilson had developed, staged accidents, corrupt medical providers, fraudulent legal representation, and violent intimidation of potential witnesses, could be replicated by other criminal entrepreneurs who understood that insurance companies were attractive targets for systematic fraud. 3 years after the trial concluded, Thompson was promoted to detective and assigned to the Financial Crimes Unit, where he specialized in investigating complex fraud schemes involving multiple participants and sophisticated methods of concealment. The skills he had developed during the Wilson investigation, patience, attention to financial details, and the ability to recognize patterns across multiple, seemingly unrelated incidents, served him well in cases involving money laundering, corporate fraud, and other crimes that required extensive documentation and analysis. He never forgot the lessons he had learned from the insurance fraud case about the importance of taking seemingly routine incidents seriously and looking for patterns that might indicate larger criminal conspiracies. The staged accident that had started his investigation could easily have been dismissed as a minor traffic incident, but persistent investigation had uncovered a violent criminal network that had operated for years. The case had also taught Thompson that some of the most dangerous criminals were those who operated behind legitimate business facades, using their understanding of legal and financial systems to commit crimes while maintaining respectability in their communities. Thomas Wilson had been a successful businessman and community leader who had contributed to charitable organizations and maintained a reputation for honesty and integrity, even while running a criminal empire that had killed people to protect its profits. The Wilson Network case became required study material for law enforcement training programs throughout the country, used to teach investigators about recognizing insurance fraud, conducting financial investigations, and understanding how violent criminal organizations could operate within seemingly legitimate business environments. Thompson was frequently invited to speak at conferences and training seminars for insurance investigators, police officers, and federal agents who specialized in financial crimes. He emphasized the importance of thorough investigation of seemingly routine incidents, careful analysis of financial records and patterns, and the need to take seriously the safety concerns of witnesses who came forward with information about criminal organizations. But for Thompson personally, the case would always be remembered as a reminder that criminal organizations often targeted the most vulnerable members of society. People like Michael Davis, who were manipulated into participating in crimes they didn't understand, and people like the fake accident participants who were recruited from economically disadvantaged communities and paid minimal amounts to take substantial legal risks. The insurance fraud network had generated over $12 million in illegal profits over 3 years, but most of that money had gone to Wilson and his top-level associates. The people who actually took the physical risks of participating in staged accidents had been paid only a few $1,000s each, and many of them had faced violence or threats when they tried to leave the organization or reduce their involvement. The case had exposed not just insurance fraud, but a form of economic exploitation that used people's desperation for income to recruit them into criminal activities that could result in serious legal consequences. Wilson had built his criminal empire by taking advantage of people who had limited legitimate opportunities to improve their economic situations, offering them short-term financial relief in exchange for participation in activities that could destroy their lives if they were caught. 10 years after the investigation began, Thompson looked back on the Wilson case as one of the most significant of his career. It had started with a routine traffic accident, but had ultimately exposed a sophisticated criminal network that had operated across multiple states, corrupted numerous professionals and institutions, and killed people to protect its profits. The case had also demonstrated the importance of patience and persistence in investigating financial crimes that were designed to appear legitimate on the surface. If Thompson had accepted the staged accident at face value and filed a routine traffic report, Wilson's network might have continued operating for years, generating millions more in fraudulent profits while victimizing countless additional people. Sometimes, the most important police work involved recognizing that seemingly ordinary incidents might be part of larger criminal patterns, and being willing to invest the time and effort required to uncover the truth, even when it led into dangerous territory. The Wilson case had required months of investigation, cooperation with federal agencies, and personal risks for officers and witnesses who challenged a violent criminal organization. But the results had been worth the effort and risk. A sophisticated criminal network had been dismantled, violent criminals had been imprisoned, and systems had been put in place to prevent similar organizations from operating with impunity in the future. Most importantly, people like Michael Davis and Sarah Peterson had been protected from further victimization, and future potential victims had been saved from recruitment into criminal activities that could have destroyed their lives. The insurance fraud network was gone, but Thompson knew that the methods Wilson had developed would probably be copied by other criminals who understood that insurance companies represented attractive targets for systematic fraud. The challenge for law enforcement was to stay ahead of these evolving criminal methods and to maintain the vigilance necessary to recognize new patterns of fraud before they could become established and profitable. The Wilson case had ended with convictions and prison sentences, but it had also raised larger questions about how society could protect vulnerable people from recruitment into criminal organizations, and how legal and financial systems could be made more resistant to corruption and exploitation. For Thompson, those questions would continue to shape his approach to law enforcement throughout the rest of his career. Every financial crime he investigated carried the potential to uncover larger patterns of criminal activity, and every witness who came forward with information deserved protection and support regardless of their background or their previous involvement with criminal organizations. The staged accident on Fulton Street had been solved, but its implications would continue to influence Thompson's understanding of how crime operated in modern urban environments and how police officers could most effectively protect the communities they served. Sometimes justice came through dramatic arrests and high-profile trials, and sometimes it came through patient investigation of routine incidents that turned out to be anything but routine. Officer Daniel Roberts thought he understood suburban crime. After 8 years patrolling Queens neighborhoods, he'd seen his share of break-ins, domestic disputes, and the occasional drug bust that disrupted the peaceful facade of middle-class family life. But the case that started with a routine community meeting in Forest Hills would expose secrets so dark and pervasive that it changed everything Roberts thought he knew about the people who lived behind those well-maintained lawns and respectable front doors. The call came through dispatch on a Thursday evening in late April, just as Roberts was finishing his paperwork from a domestic disturbance call in Elmhurst. Not an emergency call, but a routine request for police presence at a community meeting. The Forest Hills Residents Association was hosting their monthly safety meeting at the Maple Grove Court Community Center, and they'd specifically requested an officer to discuss recent crime trends and answer questions about neighborhood security measures. Roberts had attended dozens of these community meetings over the years, and they usually followed a predictable pattern. Concerned residents would ask about recent break-ins, request increased patrols during certain hours, complain about parking violations and minor, quality-of-life issues like loud music or unleashed dogs. The meetings typically lasted about an hour and ended with residents promising to keep their eyes open and report suspicious activity to police through proper channels. Forest Hills was exactly the kind of neighborhood where these meetings flourished and where residents took community safety seriously. Middle-class families who had saved for years to afford homes in a good school district, well-maintained houses with manicured lawns and fresh paint, tree-lined streets where children rode bicycles safely, and neighbors knew each other's names and occupations. The crime rate was consistently low. The schools were among the best in Queens, and the residents were the type of people who organized block parties, maintained community gardens, and volunteered for local charities. As Roberts drove through the neighborhood toward the community center, he noted the familiar signs of suburban prosperity and stability. Houses that had been built in the 1950s and 1960s, and carefully maintained by successive generations of owners who understood that property values depended on community appearance and reputation. Front yards with seasonal flowers and decorative elements that showed pride of ownership. Driveways with late-model cars that suggested financial stability and investment in the community's long-term future. The meeting was being held in the community center of Maple Grove Court, a quiet residential street that epitomized everything Roberts associated with successful suburban living. The community center was a modest building that had been funded by resident contributions and maintained by volunteer labor, featuring a main meeting room with folding chairs, a small kitchen for social events, and bulletin boards covered with announcements about community activities and volunteer opportunities. About 40 residents had gathered for the meeting, sitting in folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a small podium where Roberts would give his presentation about crime trends and safety recommendations. But something about this particular meeting felt different from similar gatherings Roberts had attended in other neighborhoods. Instead of the usual mix of elderly residents concerned about property crime and young parents worried about child safety, the crowd was dominated by a tight-knit group of neighbors who seemed unusually organized and focused on specific security issues. They had prepared detailed questions written on index cards, created charts showing crime statistics for their specific area, and brought maps marking locations where they claimed to have observed suspicious activity over the past several months. The meeting was led by a woman named Susan Matthews, who introduced herself as the president of the Maple Grove Court Neighborhood Watch Program. Matthews was in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a business suit that suggested professional success, with perfectly styled hair and makeup that spoke of someone who understood the importance of appearance and presentation. She carried herself with the kind of authoritative presence that suggested she was accustomed to running meetings, managing people, and getting things done through organization and persistence. Officer Roberts, thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule to meet with us tonight, Matthews began, her voice carrying the tone of someone who expected to be taken seriously by authority figures and who was confident in her ability to articulate community concerns effectively. We asked you here because our neighborhood has been experiencing some very concerning developments over the past 6 months. We've documented a pattern of suspicious activities that we believe indicate the presence of criminal elements who are targeting our community for illegal activities. Roberts pulled out his notebook and prepared to take notes on what he expected to be the usual complaints about loitering teenagers, unfamiliar cars parked on residential streets for extended periods, and neighbors who didn't maintain their properties to community standards or who engaged in activities that other residents found disruptive or inappropriate. But what Matthews and her fellow residents described was far more organized and systematic than the typical neighborhood concerns Roberts usually encountered at these meetings. They had compiled detailed surveillance logs documenting the movements of specific individuals over periods of weeks and months, assembled photographic evidence of what they claimed were criminal activities, and even created audio recordings of conversations they alleged to have overheard while conducting their neighborhood watch activities in various locations throughout the area. Officer Roberts, we've been working together as a coordinated team for the past 8 months to identify and monitor people who don't belong in our neighborhood, Matthews explained, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation that displayed photographs of various individuals walking through the area, sitting in parked cars, or standing on street corners. These people have been conducting drug transactions, casing houses for potential burglaries, and engaging in other criminal activities that directly threaten the safety of our families and the property values that represent our life savings and financial security. The presentation included dozens of photographs taken by residents using cameras with telephoto lenses, security systems, and even smartphones, showing people engaged in what appeared to Roberts to be completely normal activities like walking dogs, jogging for exercise, talking on cell phones, or visiting friends and family members who lived in the neighborhood. But Matthews and her associates had interpreted these routine activities through a lens of suspicion that transformed everyday behavior into evidence of criminal intent. They had developed criteria for identifying suspicious individuals that seemed increasingly problematic as Roberts listened to their detailed explanations and justifications. People were considered suspicious and worthy of surveillance if they were unfamiliar to longtime residents who claimed to know everyone who legitimately belonged in the neighborhood. If they were walking through the area without what residents considered an obvious destination or clear purpose for being there. If they were taking photographs of houses or street scenes, or talking on cell phones while walking, which residents interpreted as coordination with criminal associates. If they appeared to be casing houses by looking at them for more than a few seconds while passing by, or if they returned to the same area on multiple occasions. More concerning to Roberts was the demographic profile of virtually all the people the neighborhood watch had identified as suspicious and targeted for surveillance. Almost without exception, they appeared to be young men of color, people who were dressed casually rather than in business attire, individuals who appeared to be from lower socioeconomic backgrounds based on their clothing, vehicles, or general appearance, or people who somehow didn't fit the neighborhood watch members' conception of who belonged in their middle-class suburban community. Officer Roberts, we need official police support for our efforts to protect this community from criminal infiltration, said Robert Johnson, a man in his 50s who Matthews introduced as the neighborhood watch coordinator and surveillance team leader. We've been doing our own documentation and monitoring activities, but we need law enforcement backing to take decisive action against these criminal elements before they can establish operations in our area. Roberts was beginning to feel deeply uncomfortable with the direction of the meeting and the methods these residents were describing. While community involvement in crime prevention was generally positive and encouraged by police departments, the surveillance techniques and targeting criteria these residents were describing seemed to cross the line from legitimate neighborhood watch activities into potentially illegal harassment and stalking of people based primarily on their appearance and perceived social status, rather than their actual behavior or any evidence of criminal activity. Can you tell me about specific crimes that have been committed in your neighborhood? Roberts asked, trying to redirect the conversation toward concrete criminal activity that would justify the level of surveillance and suspicion these residents were describing. Break-ins, thefts, assaults, drug arrests, vandalism, actual criminal incidents that would support your concerns about increased criminal activity in the area. The room fell completely silent for several uncomfortable seconds before Matthews responded, her expression suggesting that she found Robert's question somewhat irrelevant to the issues they were trying to address. Officer, we believe in being proactive rather than reactive when it comes to community safety, Matthews said, her tone suggesting that she considered this approach obviously superior to traditional law enforcement methods. We're identifying potential criminal elements and monitoring their activities before they have the opportunity to commit crimes in our neighborhood. Prevention through vigilance and early intervention is much more effective than responding to crimes after they've already been committed and our families have already been victimized. But have there been any actual crimes committed by the specific people you've been surveilling and photographing? Another uncomfortable silence followed before Johnson answered, his response suggesting that he and the other residents considered evidence of criminal intent to be as significant as evidence of actual criminal activity. Officer, we've observed behavior patterns that clearly indicate criminal intent and planning, Johnson said, consulting notes he'd prepared for the meeting. People who appear to be systematically casing houses for potential break-ins. Individuals who seem to be conducting drug transactions based on their meeting patterns and exchange behaviors, suspicious gatherings that could represent gang-related activity or coordination of criminal operations in our area. Roberts asked to see specific evidence of criminal activity, and what the residents showed him was deeply troubling from both a legal and ethical perspective. Their evidence consisted almost entirely of photographs and videos of people engaged in completely legal activities, walking through the neighborhood while talking on phones, sitting in parked cars for brief periods, visiting friends or family members who lived in the area, jogging or exercising in public spaces, or simply existing in the neighborhood while not conforming to residents' expectations about who belonged there. But the neighborhood watch members had interpreted these normal, legal activities through a lens of racial and economic prejudice that systematically transformed everyday behavior into evidence of criminal intent. A young black man walking through the neighborhood while talking on his cell phone became a drug dealer coordinating transactions with criminal associates. A Hispanic family visiting relatives was characterized as potential gang members conducting surveillance for future criminal activity. An Asian college student waiting for a friend became someone casing houses for burglary opportunities. The surveillance materials also revealed that residents had been following people, recording their license plate numbers, documenting their daily routines, and sharing this information through social media groups and private communications networks that coordinated monitoring activities across multiple streets and blocks. Mr. Johnson, Ms. Matthews, I have to tell you that conducting surveillance of people who aren't committing crimes could potentially expose you to serious legal liability for harassment, stalking, and invasion of privacy," Roberts said, trying to convey the seriousness of the situation without immediately antagonizing people he might need to work with to resolve community problems. Effective neighborhood watch programs focus on reporting actual criminal activity to police rather than conducting ongoing surveillance of people based on their appearance or assumptions about their reasons for being in the neighborhood. Matthew's expression hardened noticeably at Robert's suggestion that their activities might be inappropriate or potentially illegal, and several other residents shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as if they hadn't considered the legal implications of their surveillance activities. "Officer Roberts, we have a fundamental right to protect our neighborhood and our families from criminal elements," Matthews replied, her voice taking on a defensive edge that suggested she had prepared for potential criticism of their methods. "If the police department isn't going to take proactive action against people who are clearly planning criminal activities in our community, then responsible residents have no choice but to take initiative ourselves to ensure community safety and property protection." The meeting continued for another hour and a half, with various residents sharing their observations and evidence of suspicious activity throughout the Forest Hills area. Roberts became increasingly concerned as he listened to their detailed descriptions of organized surveillance operations, direct confrontations with people they considered suspicious, coordination with what they described as like-minded residents in other Queens neighborhoods, and plans for escalating their activities if their current methods didn't succeed in deterring unwanted people from entering their area. What these people were describing wasn't a legitimate neighborhood watch program designed to support law enforcement efforts to prevent and solve crimes. It was systematic harassment of people based on racial and economic profiling, conducted under the rhetorical cover of community safety and property protection, but actually motivated by prejudice and a desire to control the demographic composition of their neighborhood. Roberts also noticed that several residents seemed uncomfortable with the direction the meeting was taking. A few older residents appeared troubled by some of the more aggressive surveillance activities being described, and he observed some people exchanging concerned glances when Matthews and Johnson discussed confronting suspicious individuals directly rather than simply reporting their observations to police. After the formal meeting ended, Roberts remained in the community center to speak, privately, with residents who had seemed hesitant to fully support the neighborhood watch program's more aggressive activities. One of them, an elderly man named William Davis who appeared to be in his 70s, approached Roberts hesitantly after most of the other attendees had left the building. "Officer Roberts, I've lived on Maple Grove Court for over 30 years, and I've never seen anything like what's been happening in our neighborhood over the past several months," Davis said, glancing around to make sure that Matthews and her core supporters weren't within listening distance. "What started as a legitimate neighborhood watch program has gradually turned into something much darker and more troubling than community safety." "What do you mean specifically, Mr. Davis?" Davis looked genuinely distressed as he described changes in the neighborhood's social dynamics over the past year. "Susan Matthews and her core group have been systematically pressuring other residents to participate in surveillance activities that go far beyond anything that could be considered normal neighborhood watch responsibilities. They're encouraging people to follow and photograph anyone they consider suspicious, to report on neighbors who don't fully support their activities, and to take confrontational actions that could easily escalate into serious legal problems or violence." Davis told Roberts about multiple incidents where neighborhood watch members had directly confronted people walking through the area, demanding identification, asking intrusive questions about their business in the neighborhood, and threatening to call police if visitors didn't leave immediately. He described organized efforts to make certain people feel unwelcome through systematic harassment, including following them, photographing them repeatedly, and spreading rumors throughout the community about their alleged criminal activities or inappropriate behavior. There's a core group of about 15 residents who meet regularly at Susan's house to coordinate these activities, and they've been pressuring other neighbors to participate actively or risk being considered unsupportive of community safety, Davis explained, his voice reflecting genuine fear about the social pressures being created in his neighborhood. They've created an atmosphere where people are afraid to express concerns about their methods, and they've made it clear that anyone who doesn't support their program might themselves become targets of suspicion and surveillance. Davis also described incidents where neighborhood watch members had engaged in activities that seemed clearly illegal, including entering private property to install surveillance equipment, following people to their homes in other neighborhoods, and coordinating with similar groups in other areas to share information about individuals they considered problematic or dangerous. I've seen neighbors I've known for decades transform into people I barely recognize, Officer Roberts. They've become obsessed with monitoring and controlling everyone who enters our neighborhood, and they've convinced themselves that they're protecting us from threats that I'm not sure actually exist. Roberts thanked Davis for his honesty and courage in speaking up about activities that were clearly making him uncomfortable, and he asked Davis to contact police immediately if he witnessed any activities that seemed illegal or threatening. But as Roberts left the community center that evening, he was deeply concerned about what he had heard and observed during the meeting. The Forest Hills Neighborhood Watch Program appeared to have evolved from legitimate community safety concerns into an organized harassment campaign, targeting people based on racial and economic prejudice. The methods being used seemed designed to drive certain categories of people away from the neighborhood through systematic intimidation, and the justifications being offered suggested that participants had convinced themselves they were protecting their community rather than victimizing innocent people. Over the next several days, Roberts began researching the Forest Hills Residents Association and the Maple Grove Court Neighborhood Watch Program more thoroughly, looking for additional information about their activities and any complaints that might have been filed about harassment or intimidation in the area. What he found suggested that the Neighborhood Watch Group had been operating with increasing levels of organization and sophistication for nearly a year, gradually expanding their surveillance activities and developing more systematic methods for monitoring and confronting people they considered undesirable or suspicious. They had created multiple social media groups for coordinating surveillance activities and sharing information about people they were monitoring. They had developed communication systems using encrypted messaging apps that allowed real-time coordination of surveillance teams. They had established detailed protocols for confronting suspicious individuals, documenting their activities, and escalating responses if initial confrontations weren't successful in deterring unwanted visitors. More disturbing were reports Roberts found from other police officers who had received complaints about harassment and intimidation in the Forest Hills area over the past several months. Multiple people had reported being followed by groups of residents, photographed without consent, and confronted by neighbors who accused them of criminal activity based entirely on their appearance and presence in the neighborhood. Roberts discovered that several formal complaints had been filed with the police department's Community Affairs Division, but most of them had been classified as minor disputes between neighbors rather than systematic harassment campaigns. The complaints had been handled individually rather than being analyzed as part of a pattern of organized intimidation activities. Roberts decided to conduct his own comprehensive investigation into the Neighborhood Watch Group's activities, starting with a thorough review of all police reports and civilian complaints from the Forest Hills area over the past year. He also began interviewing people who had been targeted by the group's surveillance and confrontation activities, looking for evidence of systematic harassment that might constitute criminal violations. What he found was a clear pattern of escalating tension and conflict that had begun shortly after Susan Matthews had organized the Neighborhood Watch program in the previous spring. Complaints about harassment, stalking, and intimidation had increased dramatically over the past 8 months, with dozens of reports describing residents confronting visitors, following people through the neighborhood, taking photographs without consent, and creating disturbances based on unfounded suspicions about criminal activity. But more concerning were reports suggesting that some neighborhood watch members had begun taking more aggressive and potentially illegal actions against people they considered threats to community safety and property values. There had been multiple incidents of property damage that appeared to target specific families, threatening phone calls made to people who had complained about harassment, and what seemed to be organized efforts to drive certain residents out of the neighborhood entirely. Roberts began systematically interviewing people who had been targeted by the Neighborhood Watch Group's activities, and their accounts painted a disturbing picture of coordinated harassment campaigns justified by claims of community protection and crime prevention. Maria Santos, a 28-year-old woman who worked as a home health aide for an elderly resident on Maple Grove Court, described being subjected to systematic surveillance and harassment over a period of several months, simply because she visited the neighborhood regularly for work purposes. "I've been taking care of Mrs. Peterson for almost 2 years, helping her with daily activities after she broke her hip," Santos told Roberts during an interview at the police station. "But about 6 months ago, neighbors started following me to and from her house, taking pictures of me in my car, asking me questions about why I was in the neighborhood and demanding to see identification even though I was just walking from the bus stop to my client's front door." Santos described incidents where multiple residents had surrounded her on the street, demanding to know her business in the neighborhood and threatening to call police if she didn't provide satisfactory explanations for her presence. She had been photographed repeatedly while walking to work, and neighbors had called her employer to complain about her suspicious behavior and to demand that she be replaced with someone more appropriate for their neighborhood. "They made me feel like a criminal for trying to do my job and help an elderly lady who needed assistance with basic daily activities," Santos continued, her voice reflecting both frustration and genuine fear about the harassment she had experienced. "It got so uncomfortable and intimidating that I seriously considered quitting. But Mrs. Peterson really needed the help and I couldn't afford to lose the income from that position." James Wilson, a 22-year-old black college student who had been visiting his girlfriend's family in the Forest Hills neighborhood, described being confronted by groups of residents who demanded identification and threatened to call police if he didn't leave the area immediately, even though he was simply walking to his girlfriend's house with flowers he had purchased for her mother's birthday celebration. "I was literally carrying flowers and a birthday card, walking down a public street to visit my girlfriend's family, when these people surrounded me and started accusing me of being a drug dealer or gang member," Wilson told Roberts. "They demanded to see my identification, wanted to know where I was going and why, and made it very clear that they considered me a threat to their neighborhood just because of how I looked and the fact that they didn't recognize me." Wilson described feeling genuinely frightened by the aggressive behavior of the residents who confronted him, and he said the experience had made him reluctant to visit his girlfriend's family again, despite having been welcomed by them and having developed friendships with other young people in the area. "They made me feel like I was doing something wrong by existing in their neighborhood, like I was automatically suspect because I was a young black man who didn't live there. It was humiliating and scary, and it made me understand how unwelcome people like me are in places like that." These weren't isolated incidents, Roberts discovered. His investigation revealed evidence of dozens of similar confrontations over the past 8 months, all following remarkably similar patterns and all targeting people who didn't fit the Neighborhood Watch Group's narrow criteria for acceptable residents and visitors. The targets included home health aides, delivery drivers, maintenance workers, college students, young professionals, and family members visiting relatives in the area. What they had in common was that they were predominantly people of color, people who appeared to be from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, or people who were young and dressed casually rather than in business attire. But Robert's most disturbing discovery came when he learned about the Neighborhood Watch Group's community protection protocols, systematic, coordinated efforts to identify families and individuals they wanted to force out of the area entirely, and the specific methods they used to accomplish this goal. According to documents Roberts obtained through interviews with concerned residents like William Davis, and through examination of social media communications, the Neighborhood Watch Group had developed detailed target lists of families they considered undesirable and wanted to remove from the neighborhood. These problematic residents included families with teenage children who were considered disruptive or inappropriate, elderly people whose properties weren't maintained to community standards, renters rather than owners who were seen as transient and uncommitted to neighborhood values, and anyone who didn't participate in or actively support the neighborhood watch activities. The group's methods for removing unwanted residents were sophisticated, coordinated, and designed to avoid obvious legal liability while maximizing pressure on targeted families. They would file multiple, coordinated complaints with city agencies about property maintenance issues, noise violations, and zoning infractions, often exaggerating minor problems or reporting violations that didn't actually exist. They would report alleged criminal activity to police repeatedly, creating false documentation of problems that could be used to justify increased law enforcement attention and potential legal action against targeted residents. They would spread rumors and false information throughout the neighborhood about their targets, damaging reputations and creating social pressure for people to move away from the area. Most disturbingly, Roberts found evidence that Neighborhood Watch members had escalated to direct intimidation tactics when their other methods weren't successful in driving away unwanted residents. There were documented incidents of property vandalism targeting specific families, including damaged cars, graffiti, and destruction of lawn and garden areas. Anonymous threatening phone calls had been made to targeted residents, warning them that they weren't welcome in the neighborhood and should move somewhere more appropriate. There had been incidents of mail theft, harassment of children walking to and from school, and systematic efforts to interfere with targeted families' daily activities through various forms of sabotage and intimidation. The investigation took a much more serious turn when Roberts received a call from Detective Lisa Thompson at the Queens North Detective Squad. Thompson had been investigating what initially appeared to be a series of isolated hate crimes in the Forest Hills area, but she was beginning to suspect that some of the incidents might be connected to organized harassment activities rather than random acts of prejudice. Officer Roberts, I understand you've been looking into complaints about harassment and intimidation in the Forest Hills area, Thompson said when she called Roberts to discuss potential coordination of their investigations. I think we might be dealing with something much more serious and organized than just overzealous residents trying to protect their neighborhood from crime. Thompson had been investigating 5 separate incidents over the past 3 months that had initially appeared to be random hate crimes committed by individuals who might not even live in the Forest Hills area. A Hispanic family's car had been vandalized with racial slurs, spray painted on the windshield, and tires slashed. An elderly black man had found his front yard littered with garbage and threatening notes telling him he didn't belong in the neighborhood. A young Asian couple had received dozens of anonymous letters and phone calls telling them they weren't welcome and should move somewhere more appropriate for people like them. At first, these incidents had seemed unrelated, isolated acts of racism and hatred committed by individuals acting independently based on personal prejudices. But as Thompson conducted her investigation, she began to identify patterns and connections that suggested systematic planning and coordination rather than random acts of hatred by unconnected individuals. The timing of these hate crime incidents correlates almost perfectly with periods of increased neighborhood watch activity, Thompson explained to Roberts when they met to compare notes and coordinate their investigations. And witnesses have reported seeing groups of residents in the areas where these crimes occurred, both immediately before and after the incidents took place. Thompson had also discovered that the families targeted by hate crimes had all been previously identified as problematic or suspicious by the Maple Grove Court Neighborhood Watch Program. Their names appeared on surveillance lists and target lists that Neighborhood Watch members had shared through social media groups, encrypted messaging systems, and private communications networks. Roberts and Thompson decided to combine their investigations, pooling their knowledge of the Neighborhood Watch Group's activities with Thompson's expertise in investigating hate crimes, organized harassment campaigns, and conspiracy cases that involved multiple perpetrators working together to target specific victims. Working together over the next several weeks, they began to uncover evidence of a systematic campaign of intimidation, harassment, and violence that went far beyond legitimate community safety concerns and represented a coordinated effort to control the racial and economic composition of the Forest Hills neighborhood through illegal means. The scope and sophistication of the conspiracy became clear when Roberts and Thompson obtained court orders allowing them to examine the social media accounts, electronic communications, and digital records of key Neighborhood Watch members. What they found was extensive documentation of illegal activities, including detailed plans for harassment campaigns, coordination of property damage and vandalism, discussions about escalating tactics if their initial efforts weren't successful in forcing unwanted residents to leave the area. Susan Matthews, the Neighborhood Watch president and primary organizer, had been the central coordinator of most of these illegal activities. Her communications revealed sophisticated planning and research into methods for conducting harassment campaigns while minimizing the risk of criminal prosecution. She had studied legal boundaries for community activism, researched techniques used by other groups to drive away unwanted residents, and developed detailed protocols for organized intimidation that were specifically designed to avoid obvious criminal liability while maximizing psychological pressure on targeted individuals and families. Matthews had also been in regular communication with similar groups in other Queens neighborhoods, sharing successful harassment techniques, coordinating activities across multiple areas, and working to develop a regional network of residents committed to maintaining what they considered appropriate demographic compositions in their communities. But perhaps most disturbing were communications showing that Matthews and her core associates had been discussing escalating to more direct violence if their harassment campaigns weren't successful in achieving their goals. Electronic communications obtained through court orders included detailed conversations about vandalizing property, making more explicit threats against residents and their families, and potentially using physical violence against people who refused to leave the neighborhood despite sustained intimidation efforts. The investigation expanded dramatically when Roberts and Thompson discovered that the Forest Hills Neighborhood Watch Group was part of a much larger network of similar organizations operating throughout Queens and Nassau County, all using nearly identical methods and apparently coordinating their activities through regional communications networks and regular meetings between group leaders. Working with federal authorities who had jurisdiction over civil rights violations, conspiracy cases, and organized criminal activities that crossed local boundaries, Roberts and Thompson began investigating these connected groups and building comprehensive cases against the network's leadership and most active participants. What they uncovered through months of investigation was a sophisticated network of middle-class residents across multiple suburban communities who were using neighborhood watch programs as fronts for systematic discrimination, harassment, and intimidation campaigns designed to control neighborhood demographics and drive away families and individuals they considered undesirable based on race, ethnicity, economic status, and other characteristics. The network included professionals, business owners, community leaders, and local government employees who had developed highly sophisticated methods for targeting people they wanted to remove from their communities. They shared detailed information about successful harassment techniques, coordinated activities across neighborhood boundaries, and provided mutual support and legal assistance for members who faced criminal charges or civil lawsuits related to their activities. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of the network Roberts and Thompson uncovered was the systematic use of children and teenagers to conduct surveillance and harassment activities against targeted families. Young people were recruited and trained to follow and photograph targeted individuals, to gather information about families' daily routines and vulnerabilities, and to spread intimidating messages and rumors through social media networks and school-based communication systems. The children and teenagers involved in these activities often didn't fully understand the illegal nature of what they were doing or the potential harm they were causing to innocent people. They had been told by adult organizers that they were helping to protect their neighborhoods and families from criminals and dangerous individuals, and many of them genuinely believed they were performing important community service rather than participating in systematic harassment and intimidation campaigns. Roberts interviewed several teenagers who had been involved in neighborhood watch surveillance activities for periods of several months, and their accounts revealed how adult organizers had systematically manipulated young people into participating in illegal activities while convincing them they were helping to protect their communities. Mrs. Matthews and the other adults told us we were like junior police officers, helping to keep our neighborhood safe from criminals and drug dealers, explained Jennifer Peterson, a 16-year-old who had participated in surveillance activities for almost 6 months before becoming uncomfortable with some of the tasks she was being asked to perform. They said the people we were watching and following were dangerous individuals who wanted to hurt our families and bring crime and violence to our area. Peterson described being given specific surveillance assignments, following particular individuals, photographing their activities, and documenting their daily routines, reporting on their movements and associations with other people. The adult organizers had made these activities seem exciting and important, while using the information gathered by teenagers to plan harassment campaigns and direct intimidation efforts against their targets. I didn't realize until much later that we were basically stalking innocent people and helping adults plan ways to hurt and intimidate them, Peterson continued, her voice reflecting genuine distress about her participation in activities she hadn't fully understood at the time. When I finally figured out what was really happening and how we were being used to harm people who hadn't done anything wrong, I felt sick about what I had been doing. The use of minors in organized harassment and intimidation activities added serious federal charges to the developing case against the neighborhood watch networks, including child endangerment, using minors to commit federal crimes, and conspiracy to violate civil rights laws through systematic intimidation and harassment. The FBI became actively involved in the investigation at this point, bringing substantial resources and specialized expertise in civil rights violations, organized conspiracy cases, and complex investigations involving multiple jurisdictions and dozens of participants. Federal agents began conducting comprehensive surveillance of the neighborhood watch networks, documenting their activities, communications, and coordination across different communities and building cases that would allow for prosecution of the entire conspiracy under federal civil rights laws. Over the course of 8 months, federal agents and local detectives documented extensive evidence of organized harassment, intimidation, and violence designed to drive targeted residents out of specific neighborhoods based on their race, ethnicity, economic status, and other protected characteristics. The evidence included thousands of electronic communications between network participants, surveillance photographs and videos showing harassment activities, financial records documenting coordination and funding of illegal activities, and testimony from dozens of victims who had been systematically targeted by the network's campaigns. The investigation also revealed that the neighborhood watch networks had been planning significant expansions of their operations, including recruitment of participants in Brooklyn and Manhattan neighborhoods, development of more sophisticated surveillance and harassment techniques, and coordination with similar organizations in other metropolitan areas across the United States. Communications between network leaders discussed creating regional and national networks that would share successful techniques for controlling neighborhood demographics, coordinate activities across multiple states, and provide legal and financial support for members who faced prosecution for their harassment and intimidation activities. The case finally broke open when federal agents executed simultaneous arrests of Susan Matthews and 12 other key organizers of the neighborhood watch networks on a single morning in November, catching the leadership off guard and preventing them from destroying evidence or fleeing to avoid prosecution. The arrests were coordinated across multiple locations in Queens, Nassau County, and Suffolk County, with federal agents and local police executing search warrants at the homes and offices of network participants to seize computers, documents, cell phones, surveillance equipment, and other evidence of their illegal activities. The evidence seized during the arrests revealed the full scope and sophistication of the conspiracy that had been operating for over 2 years. The neighborhood watch networks had affected dozens of neighborhoods across the New York metropolitan area, had successfully forced more than 40 families to move out of areas where they had been targeted for sustained harassment campaigns, and had been planning systematic expansion of their operations to affect hundreds of additional families across multiple states. The networks had also been working to influence local political processes, supporting candidates who would implement policies favorable to their demographic control efforts, and opposing politicians who supported fair housing initiatives, anti-discrimination laws, and other policies that would interfere with their ability to control neighborhood compositions through harassment and intimidation. Documents seized during the arrests showed that network leaders had been researching techniques used by similar groups in other parts of the country, studying legal boundaries for harassment activities, and developing increasingly sophisticated methods for avoiding detection and prosecution, while maximizing pressure on targeted families and individuals. The arrests and subsequent revelations about the neighborhood watch networks made national news as one of the largest civil rights conspiracy cases in New York state history. Media coverage exposed how seemingly legitimate community safety programs could be systematically corrupted and used as fronts for organized discrimination and harassment campaigns, highlighting the vulnerability of minority families and economically disadvantaged individuals in suburban communities where residents were willing to organize systematic campaigns of intimidation. The story also generated significant discussion about the role of social media and electronic communications in enabling and coordinating harassment campaigns, the challenges law enforcement faced in identifying and prosecuting organized discrimination that operated under the cover of legitimate community activities, and the need for stronger legal protections for people targeted by systematic harassment based on their race, ethnicity, or economic status. Susan Matthews and 11 other neighborhood watch leaders were eventually convicted on federal civil rights violations, conspiracy charges, child endangerment counts, and various state charges related to harassment, stalking, intimidation, and property damage. They received sentences ranging from 8 to 20 years in federal prison, depending on their level of leadership within the networks and the severity of their individual participation in illegal activities. Matthews herself, as the primary organizer and coordinator of the conspiracy, received a 20-year federal sentence, and was ordered to pay substantial restitution to families who had been forced to move because of harassment campaigns, suffered property damage, or incurred other financial losses as a result of the network's illegal activities. Dozens of other neighborhood watch participants were charged with various crimes related to harassment, intimidation, civil rights violations, and child endangerment. Some received shorter prison sentences, while others were sentenced to supervised probation, community service, and mandatory participation in educational programs designed to address the racial and ethnic prejudices that had motivated their criminal activities. The affected neighborhoods underwent significant changes in the aftermath of the arrests, convictions, and extensive media coverage of the conspiracy. Many residents who had been targeted by harassment campaigns chose to remain in their homes, supported by community organizations, legal advocacy groups, and local government programs that helped them recover from the psychological and financial trauma of systematic intimidation and harassment. New neighborhood watch programs were eventually established in some areas, but with strict oversight from law enforcement agencies, community organizations, and civil rights groups to ensure that they focused exclusively on legitimate crime prevention activities and couldn't be corrupted by individuals seeking to use them for harassment or discrimination purposes. These new programs operated under detailed guidelines that prohibited surveillance of people engaged in legal activities, required reporting of suspicious activities through official police channels rather than direct confrontation, and included regular training about civil rights laws and appropriate boundaries for community safety activities. For Roberts, the Forest Hills case became a defining experience that shaped his understanding of how ordinary, apparently respectable people could be organized and motivated to participate in systematic criminal activities under the rhetorical cover of community protection and family safety. Many of the neighborhood watch participants had genuinely believed they were protecting their neighborhoods and families from criminal threats, but they had been led and manipulated by individuals who used those legitimate concerns to advance illegal agendas based on racial prejudice, economic discrimination, and desires to control neighborhood demographics through intimidation and violence. The investigation also demonstrated how sophisticated modern harassment campaigns could be, using social media platforms, encrypted communications, coordinated surveillance techniques, and systematic legal research to maximize their impact on targeted victims while minimizing the risk of criminal prosecution for perpetrators. The network leaders had studied civil rights law extensively, developing harassment methods that were designed to terrorize victims while staying just within legal boundaries, or at least making prosecution difficult and expensive for law enforcement agencies with limited resources. But perhaps most troubling to Roberts was the discovery of how many otherwise law-abiding residents had been willing to participate in systematic harassment and intimidation once they were convinced it was justified by community safety concerns and property protection needs. Dozens of people who considered themselves responsible citizens and community leaders had engaged in illegal surveillance, vandalism, stalking, and intimidation because they believed they were protecting their neighborhoods from undesirable elements and criminal threats. The case also revealed the vulnerability of suburban communities to organized discrimination campaigns that operated under the cover of legitimate community programs. The neighborhood watch networks had been able to recruit participants, coordinate illegal activities, and maintain their operations for years without attracting serious law enforcement attention because they appeared to be engaged in activities that were generally supported and encouraged by police departments and community leaders. 3 months after the major arrests, Roberts received additional training in civil rights law enforcement and was assigned to work with the Queens District Attorney's Civil Rights Bureau, specializing in investigating hate crimes, organized harassment campaigns, and other violations of civil rights laws that required coordination between local and federal law enforcement agencies. The skills he had developed during the Forest Hills investigation, recognizing patterns of organized harassment, understanding how legitimate community programs could be systematically corrupted for illegal purposes, working with federal agencies on complex civil rights cases, and building trust with victims who had been targeted by systematic discrimination, served him well in his expanded role investigating similar cases throughout Queens and cooperating with federal authorities on regional civil rights enforcement efforts. But the Forest Hills case also left Roberts with lasting concerns about the potential for community programs and civic organizations to be used as fronts for discriminatory activities that could operate for years without detection if law enforcement agencies didn't maintain appropriate oversight, and community members didn't have effective ways to report harassment and intimidation without fear of retaliation. Every neighborhood watch program, community safety initiative, residents association, or civic organization Roberts encountered in his subsequent work was now evaluated through the lens of what he had learned about how easily legitimate community concerns could be manipulated to justify illegal harassment, discrimination, and violence against vulnerable individuals and families. Roberts also became acutely aware of how difficult it could be for victims of systematic harassment to get appropriate law enforcement response, especially when the harassment was conducted by organized groups of apparently respectable community members who understood how to present their activities as legitimate community safety efforts rather than criminal conspiracies designed to terrorize and intimidate people based on their race, ethnicity, or economic status. The case had demonstrated that modern civil rights violations often operated through seemingly legitimate organizations and programs, using sophisticated techniques developed through research and coordination between multiple groups operating in different communities. The Forest Hills Neighborhood Watch Network hadn't been an isolated incident, or the result of a few prejudiced individuals acting independently. It had been part of a coordinated effort involving dozens of people across multiple communities, all working together to achieve similar goals through similar methods. 2 years after the arrests and convictions, Roberts was invited to speak at a national conference on civil rights enforcement, sharing the lessons learned from the Forest Hills investigation with law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and community leaders from across the United States. His presentation focused on recognizing the warning signs of organized harassment campaigns, understanding how legitimate community programs could be corrupted for discriminatory purposes, and developing effective law enforcement responses that could protect victims while respecting the rights of community members engaged in legitimate safety and advocacy activities. During his presentation, Roberts emphasized that the Forest Hills case had demonstrated the importance of taking seriously complaints from people who reported being targeted by harassment campaigns, even when those complaints initially seemed minor, or when the people making complaints were from communities that might be marginalized or ignored by law enforcement agencies, operating under resource constraints or institutional biases. Modern civil rights violations don't always announce themselves with obvious symbols or blatant acts of violence, Roberts told the conference audience. They often operate through organized networks that use legitimate community programs as cover for systematic harassment and intimidation, designed to control neighborhood demographics through methods that are specifically calculated to avoid obvious criminal liability. Roberts explained how the Forest Hills investigation had required months of patient work to uncover evidence of criminal activity that was designed to appear legitimate on the surface, and how the case had ultimately required coordination between local police, state prosecutors, and federal agencies to successfully prosecute a conspiracy that involved dozens of participants operating across multiple jurisdictions. The people running these harassment campaigns study civil rights law more carefully than many law enforcement officers do, Roberts continued. They understand exactly what evidence prosecutors need to prove criminal violations, and they design their activities to make that evidence difficult and expensive to obtain. Successful prosecution requires sustained commitment from law enforcement agencies and prosecutors who are willing to invest the time and resources necessary to document systematic patterns of harassment and intimidation. The conference presentation led to Roberts being recruited by the FBI's Civil Rights Division to work on a task force investigating similar neighborhood watch conspiracies in other metropolitan areas across the United States. The task force had identified patterns of organized harassment in suburban communities in at least 12 states, all using methods and organizational techniques that were remarkably similar to those developed by the Forest Hills networks. Working with federal agents and local law enforcement officers from across the country, Roberts helped investigate and prosecute similar cases in communities where residents had organized systematic campaigns to control neighborhood demographics through harassment, intimidation, and violence disguised as legitimate community safety activities. These investigations revealed that the techniques developed by the Forest Hills networks had been shared through internet forums, regional conferences, and informal networks of like-minded residents who were committed to maintaining what they considered appropriate demographic compositions in their communities. The methods had been refined and adapted for different local conditions, but the basic organizational principles and harassment techniques were remarkably consistent across different regions and communities. Over the course of 3 years, working with the federal task force, Roberts participated in investigations that resulted in the prosecution of over 200 people involved in organized harassment campaigns in suburban communities across 15 states. The cases revealed a coordinated national network of residents who were using neighborhood watch programs, homeowners associations, and other community organizations as fronts for systematic discrimination designed to drive away families and individuals they considered undesirable, based on race, ethnicity, religion, economic status, and other protected characteristics. But perhaps more importantly, the investigations led to significant changes in how law enforcement agencies monitored community organizations and responded to complaints about harassment and discrimination. Police departments across the country implemented new training programs for officers who worked with neighborhood watch groups, developed protocols for identifying and investigating organized harassment campaigns, and established partnerships with civil rights organizations that could provide support and advocacy for victims of systematic intimidation. Community organizations also developed new oversight mechanisms for neighborhood watch programs and other citizen safety initiatives, establishing clear boundaries for appropriate activities and creating reporting systems that allowed community members to raise concerns about harassment or discrimination without fear of retaliation from program leaders or other participants. These policy changes were designed to preserve the legitimate community safety benefits of neighborhood watch programs while preventing their use as fronts for discriminatory harassment and intimidation. The goal was to maintain community involvement in crime prevention while ensuring that such programs couldn't be systematically corrupted by individuals who wanted to use them to advance illegal agendas based on prejudice and discrimination. 5 years after the original Forest Hills investigation, Roberts looked back on the case as the most significant of his law enforcement career. It had exposed a sophisticated network of organized harassment that had affected dozens of families across multiple communities, had resulted in major policy changes designed to protect vulnerable populations from systematic discrimination, and had led to his own professional development as a specialist in civil rights enforcement. The case had also demonstrated the critical importance of taking seriously complaints from people who reported being targeted by harassment campaigns, even when those complaints initially seemed minor, when the alleged perpetrators were apparently respectable community members, or when the harassment was disguised as legitimate community safety activities. Roberts had learned that modern civil rights violations often operated through organized networks that used sophisticated techniques developed through research, coordination, and systematic study of legal boundaries designed to maximize impact on victims while minimizing legal liability for perpetrators. The neighborhood watch networks had represented a new form of organized discrimination that required new law enforcement approaches and new legal strategies to successfully investigate and prosecute. But the investigation had also revealed the resilience and courage of people who had been targeted by systematic harassment campaigns, but who had been willing to come forward and cooperate with law enforcement despite personal risks and community pressures. Victims like Maria Santos and James Wilson had provided crucial testimony and evidence that made prosecutions possible, even though doing so required them to relive traumatic experiences and potentially expose themselves to continued harassment from network participants who hadn't been arrested. The Forest Hills case had ended with significant prison sentences for the network's leaders and substantial policy changes designed to prevent similar conspiracies from operating in the future. But Roberts understood that the underlying prejudices and willingness to engage in organized harassment that had motivated the original conspiracy were probably present in many other communities where residents felt threatened by demographic changes or where community leaders were willing to exploit legitimate safety concerns to advance discriminatory agendas. The investigation had been successful in dismantling one specific network and prosecuting its participants, but it had also revealed larger social and political dynamics that created conditions where organized harassment campaigns could develop and operate for extended periods before being detected and stopped by law enforcement agencies. Roberts continued to work on civil rights enforcement cases throughout his career, always mindful of the lessons learned from the Forest Hills investigation about the importance of recognizing organized harassment patterns, taking victim complaints seriously regardless of their apparent social status or community standing, and understanding how legitimate community programs could be systematically corrupted for illegal purposes. 7 years after the original arrests, Roberts received a letter from Maria Santos, the home health aide who had been one of the first people targeted by the Forest Hills Neighborhood Watch harassment campaign. She wrote to thank him for taking her complaint seriously when she had first called the police about being followed and photographed, and for pursuing an investigation that ultimately protected her and many other people from continued intimidation and harassment. Officer Roberts, when I first called the police about what was happening to me, I was afraid nobody would believe me or care about what these people were doing, Santos wrote. But you listened to me and took action to protect not just me, but dozens of other people who were being targeted by these groups. Thank you for treating us like human beings who deserve to live and work in peace, and for showing that law enforcement could protect people like us from organized harassment and intimidation. Santos had remained in her position as a home health aide, continuing to provide care for elderly residents who needed assistance with daily activities. The harassment campaign that had made her consider quitting her job and avoiding the Forest Hills area had ended completely with the arrests of the neighborhood watch leaders, allowing her to continue providing essential services to community members who depended on her professional skills and personal dedication. Roberts kept Santos's letter as a reminder of why civil rights enforcement represented some of the most important work that law enforcement officers could perform, even when it involved investigating people who considered themselves respectable community members rather than obvious criminals. The harassment campaigns had caused genuine harm to real people who had been targeted for systematic intimidation based on their race, ethnicity, economic status, and other characteristics that should never have made them targets for organized criminal activity. The Forest Hills case had also led to lasting friendships and professional relationships with other law enforcement officers who specialized in civil rights investigations. Roberts maintained regular contact with Detective Lisa Thompson, who had become a nationally recognized expert in investigating organized harassment campaigns and hate crimes that operated through apparently legitimate community organizations. Together, Roberts and Thompson developed training materials that were used by law enforcement agencies across the country to teach officers how to recognize signs of organized harassment, conduct effective investigations of systematic discrimination campaigns, and work with prosecutors and civil rights organizations to protect victims while building cases that could successfully prosecute complex conspiracy charges. Their training programs emphasized that civil rights violations in suburban communities often looked very different from traditional hate crimes that involved obvious symbols or blatant acts of violence. Modern discrimination frequently operated through organized networks that used legitimate community programs as cover for systematic harassment designed to control neighborhood demographics through intimidation and economic pressure rather than direct violence. The training also stressed the importance of understanding how victims of organized harassment might be reluctant to report their experiences to law enforcement, either because they feared retaliation from powerful community members or because they doubted that police would take their complaints seriously when the alleged perpetrators were apparently respectable residents engaged in community safety activities. 10 years after the Forest Hills investigation began, Roberts was promoted to supervise the Civil Rights Unit of the Queens District Attorney's Office, overseeing a team of detectives who specialized in investigating hate crimes, organized harassment campaigns, housing discrimination, and other violations of civil rights laws that required coordination between local and federal law enforcement agencies. In his supervisory role, Roberts continued to emphasize the lessons learned from the Forest Hills case about the importance of recognizing patterns of organized harassment, taking victim complaints seriously regardless of the apparent respectability of alleged perpetrators, and understanding how legitimate community programs could be corrupted for discriminatory purposes. Under Roberts' leadership, the Civil Rights Unit developed new protocols for investigating complaints about systematic harassment, established partnerships with community organizations that could provide support and advocacy for victims of discrimination, and created training programs that helped other law enforcement officers throughout New York City recognize and investigate similar cases. The unit also worked closely with federal authorities to identify and prosecute organized harassment networks that operated across multiple jurisdictions, sharing intelligence and coordinating investigations that required resources and legal authority beyond what local agencies could provide independently. Roberts' team investigated dozens of cases involving organized discrimination and harassment over the years, including housing discrimination schemes, employment-based harassment campaigns, and systematic efforts to drive minority-owned businesses out of specific commercial areas. While each case had unique characteristics, many of them shared organizational features and methods that had first been identified during the Forest Hills Neighborhood Watch investigation. The most significant case Roberts' unit handled involved a network of landlords and property management companies that had been systematically discriminating against minority tenants through coordinated harassment, illegal eviction attempts, and maintenance negligence designed to force targeted families to move out of specific apartment buildings and neighborhoods. The investigation revealed that the landlords had been sharing information about tenants they wanted to remove, coordinating harassment activities across multiple properties, and using legal and financial pressure to drive away families based on their race, ethnicity, and economic status. The case resulted in major civil rights violations, prosecutions, and substantial financial settlements for affected families. But for Roberts, the most important aspect of his continuing work in civil rights enforcement was the opportunity to prevent future harassment campaigns by identifying and investigating suspicious activities before they could escalate to the levels of systematic intimidation and violence that had characterized the Forest Hills neighborhood watch networks. The unit's proactive investigations had identified and disrupted several developing harassment campaigns in their early stages, preventing them from growing into large-scale conspiracies that could affect dozens of families over periods of years. early intervention had proven to be much more effective than reactive investigations that began only after harassment campaigns had been operating for extended periods. Roberts also worked with community organizations, civil rights advocacy groups, and local government agencies to develop educational programs that helped residents understand the differences between legitimate community safety activities and harassment campaigns that violated civil rights laws. These programs were designed to preserve community involvement in crime prevention while preventing the kind of systematic corruption that had characterized the Forest Hills neighborhood watch networks. Looking back on his career 15 years after the original Forest Hills investigation, Roberts considered the case to be a perfect example of how patient, thorough police work could uncover and prosecute sophisticated criminal conspiracies that operated under the cover of legitimate community activities. The investigation had required months of careful work to document patterns of harassment and intimidation that were designed to appear legal on the surface, but it had ultimately protected dozens of families from continued persecution and had established important legal precedents for prosecuting organized discrimination campaigns. The case had also demonstrated the critical importance of listening to victims who reported being targeted by harassment, even when their complaints initially seemed minor, or when the alleged perpetrators were apparently respectable community members. Maria Santos's willingness to report the harassment she experienced, and Robert's decision to take her complaints seriously, had been the starting point for an investigation that ultimately exposed a multi-state conspiracy involving hundreds of participants. Most importantly, the Forest Hills case had shown that civil rights enforcement required sustained commitment from law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, and community organizations working together to protect vulnerable populations from systematic discrimination and harassment. The investigation had been successful because it involved coordination between local police, state prosecutors, federal agencies, and civil rights advocacy groups, all working toward the common goal of ensuring that all residents could live in peace regardless of their race, ethnicity, economic status, or other characteristics. The neighborhood watch networks that had terrorized the Forest Hills community were gone. Their leaders were serving federal prison sentences, and the affected neighborhoods had recovered from years of systematic harassment and intimidation. But Roberts understood that similar organizations were probably developing in other communities where residents felt threatened by demographic changes and where community leaders were willing to exploit legitimate safety concerns to advance discriminatory agendas. The challenge for civil rights enforcement was to remain vigilant for signs of organized harassment, to respond quickly and effectively when such campaigns were identified, and to maintain the partnerships and resources necessary to protect vulnerable communities from systematic discrimination and intimidation. The Forest Hills case had ended with justice for the victims and accountability for the perpetrators, but it had also established a model for investigating and prosecuting organized harassment campaigns that continued to be used by law enforcement agencies across the country. The methods developed during the investigation had been refined and adapted for different types of cases, but the basic principles, patient documentation of harassment patterns, coordination between multiple agencies, and sustained commitment to protecting victims, remained relevant for all civil rights enforcement efforts. Sometimes, the most important police work involved recognizing that apparently routine complaints might be part of larger criminal conspiracies, and being willing to invest the time and resources necessary to uncover the truth, even when it led into territory where respectable community members were engaged in systematic criminal activity. The Forest Hills investigation had required exactly that kind of commitment, and the results had justified the effort and resources invested in exposing and prosecuting a conspiracy that had affected dozens of families across multiple communities. For Roberts, the case would always represent both the potential for community programs to be corrupted by individuals with discriminatory agendas and the effectiveness of comprehensive civil rights enforcement, when law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, and community organizations worked together to protect vulnerable populations from organized harassment and intimidation.